I can still smell the pine needles and damp earth if I close my eyes, even now, years later. Sometimes I swear I can feel the cold bite of late autumn air on one cheek and the gentle warmth of spring on the other. It's a phantom sensation, a memory burned into my senses from that place, that God-forsaken meadow. I was 26 then, still young enough to think I was invincible, old enough to be a seasoned outdoorsman, or so I thought. My name's Alex, and I'd spent most of my life rambling through the backwoods of upstate New York. Not for sport, not really for adventure, but for peace. My job as a freelance graphic designer meant I could work from anywhere with internet, and my tiny cabin on the edge of the Adirondacks was my sanctuary. It was remote, bordering a vast stretch of protected wilderness that rarely saw human traffic, especially off the marked trails. That was the whole point. I craved the quiet, the isolation. I thought I knew every rock, every bend in the creek, every shadowed path within a 20-mile radius of my property. I was wrong. My routine was simple. Work early, then grab my day pack, water, a few energy bars, a multi-tool, my phone, mostly for GPS and emergencies. Signal was patchy at best, and my old battered camera. I'd head out for a long hike, usually a different route each day, exploring deeper into the lesser-known areas. This particular day, late September, was supposed to be no different. The air was crisp, the leaves just starting to turn in earnest, painting the canopy in shades of fiery orange and deep crimson. It was perfect hiking weather, the kind that makes you feel alive. My vulnerability, my biggest mistake, was complacency. I'd grown too comfortable, too familiar with the wilderness, thinking it held no secrets from me. And that day I was alone. I always was, which wasn't unusual, but it meant there was no one to question my decisions, no one to share a gut feeling with, no one to confirm what my eyes were seeing. I told myself 1,000 times, never go off trail without a detailed map and compass, and always tell someone where you're going. But that afternoon, with the sun already past its peak and a mild autumn chill settling in, I strayed. I was trying to find an old trapper's cabin I'd seen marked on a topological map years ago, a relic supposedly long gone. I followed a deer trail that branched off my usual loop, pushing through dense thickets of young birch and hemlock. The undergrowth was thicker than I expected, and soon I was relying more on instinct than any discernible path. The sun dipped lower, casting long, distorted shadows that made the familiar woods feel suddenly alien. The air grew colder, and a dampness seeped into my boots, a sign of evening approaching faster than I'd anticipated. I knew I should turn back. The smart thing to do was retrace my steps, get back to a known path before twilight truly fell. But something pushed me on, a foolish sense of curiosity, the thrill of the unknown. And then I saw it, not the cabin, but a break in the trees, a sudden burst of light where there should have been only more forest. It was a clearing, bathed in an impossibly bright, almost dazzling light, unlike anything I'd ever seen filtering through the dense canopy. As I pushed through the last line of evergreens, stepping out into the open, a shiver, cold and sharp, traced its way down my spine. The air here was different. It hit me first, not the chill I expected, but a strange mix of temperatures. On my left, I felt the unmistakable bite of winter, a faint, almost metallic tang like snow was about to fall. Yet to my right, a gentle, fragrant warmth, carrying the scent of blooming wildflowers, drifted past me. Before my eyes could even fully process the impossible scene before me, a single, vibrant yellow dandelion, impossibly out of season, swayed gently in a breeze that carried the distinct, crisp scent of autumn leaves. The seed of dread had been planted. My mind, usually so quick to rationalize and categorize, stuttered. The cold and warmth on opposite cheeks, the impossible dandelion, it was too much, too contradictory. My breath hitched, a thin, frosty plume escaping my lips on the left side of my face, while the air flowing over my right was sweet, humid. My eyes darted around, trying to make sense of the clearing. It wasn't just a patch of grass. It was a meadow, vast and circular, perhaps a quarter-mile across, surrounded by a wall of trees that seemed to shift and blur at their edges. The light wasn't coming from a specific source like the sun, which should have been low in the west. Instead, it permeated everything, a brilliant, diffused glow that made shadows soft and indistinct, yet somehow sharpened every detail. It was like standing inside a giant, luminous pearl. The most striking feature, the one that stole my breath and rooted me to the spot, was the utterly impossible tableau within the meadow itself. It was bisected not by a physical line, but by a stark, absolute division of seasons. To my immediate left, a harsh, almost brutal winter landscape dominated. The ground was covered in a pristine blanket of freshly fallen snow, sparkling under the strange light. Ancient gnarled pines, their needles heavy with snow, stood sentinel. A thin, icy crust gleamed on what must have been dormant grass beneath. The air here was sharp, invigorating, the kind that stung your nostrils and promised frostbite. I could see my breath clearly, hear the faint crunch of imaginary snow underfoot. But then, just a few yards to my right, the world exploded in vibrant color and scent. A riot of wildflowers, purples, yellows, reds, bloomed profusely, their delicate petals unfurling towards the impossible light. Tall grasses swayed gently, a lush, verdant green that spoke of peak summer. The air here was soft, humid, thick with the earthy sweetness of pollen and rich soil. I could almost hear the hum of bees, though none were visible. And directly in front of me, straddling the invisible divide, was the dandelion. It swayed, yellow and defiant, rooted in what appeared to be dark, rich soil, yet surrounded by both the crisp, golden-brown detritus of autumn leaves and the delicate frost of early winter. The breeze that stirred its head carried the unmistakable, comforting scent of burning leaves and damp earth, a purely autumnal fragrance, yet it was simultaneously chilling on one side and warmly fragrant on the other. It was a sensory assault, a direct contradiction to every law of nature I understood. Fear, cold and sharp, coiled in my stomach. This wasn't just a strange weather pattern or an optical illusion. This was fundamentally, impossibly wrong. My initial impulse was to turn and flee, to scramble back through the thicket to find the deer trail to get out. But I found myself paralyzed, caught in a trance by the sheer, overwhelming impossibility of it all. My eyes, refusing to accept what they saw, tried to find the seams, the trick, the explanation. There was none. The transition was seamless, perfect, an invisible boundary that defied logic. My brain, desperate for a foothold in reality, started cataloging details. The snow on the left looked real, untouched. I could almost feel its texture. The flowers on the right were equally vivid, their colors almost painfully bright. There was no haze, no blur where the seasons met. It was a clean, precise division, as if an invisible knife had sliced the world in half. I took a tentative step forward, my left foot sinking slightly into what felt like firm, cold ground, my right hovering over air that felt almost balmy. My heart hammered against my ribs. The sound of it seemed amplified in the surreal quiet of the meadow, a counterpoint to the distant, muffled chirps of unseen birds on the spring side and the absolute stillness of the winter side. I had to be dreaming or hallucinating. Maybe I'd hit my head. I reached up, my fingers brushing against my temple, finding no bump, no injury. I pinched myself hard. The pain was real, sharp, undeniable. This was real. A wave of nausea washed over me. My carefully constructed world, built on predictable physics and observable phenomena, was crumbling around me. I was an experienced woodsman. I knew the rules of the wild. This place didn't play by any rules I knew. Taking a deep, shaky breath, I forced myself to move. Flight was still a powerful instinct, but something stronger, a primal curiosity, perhaps a desperate need to understand, held me captive. I edged forward, my backpack feeling suddenly heavy, my multi-tool and camera a flimsy comfort against this unknown. As I moved deeper into the clearing, the strange light intensified slightly, bathing everything in an otherworldly glow. It wasn't harsh, but it was relentless, casting no true shadows, making depth perception strangely difficult. The trees that ringed the meadow, mostly hemlock and birch, seemed to warp at the edges, their forms indistinct, as if sketched by a hurried hand. They were the same trees that lined the woods I knew, yet here they held an unsettling stillness, an ancient, watchful quality. I stopped at the edge of the seasonal divide, one foot in the crisp autumn air, the other teetering on the brink of winter's domain. I looked down. The ground beneath my left foot was a rich, dark loam, littered with perfectly preserved autumn leaves, reds, golds, and browns. A gentle breeze, carrying the scent of wood smoke and decaying foliage, rustled through them. To my right, barely a foot away, the ground was dusted with a fine layer of frost, sparkling like scattered diamonds. The grass beneath it was brittle, yellowed, unmistakably winter dormant. I slowly brought my left foot down fully, then my right, carefully placing it onto the frosty ground. The cold bit through my boot, a sharp, unpleasant sensation. I shivered, not just from the cold, but from the sheer wrongness of it. It was like stepping into two different worlds simultaneously. My gaze drifted across the meadow. In the distance, beyond the snow-covered expanse, I saw something else, something that made my blood run colder than the winter air. In the very center of the meadow, where the four impossible seasons seemed to converge, stood a structure. It wasn't a cabin, it was a monolith, a tower of dark, polished stone, ancient and impossibly tall. It rose from the ground with an alien grace, perfectly smooth, without seams or windows, tapering slightly as it ascended, disappearing into the luminous haze above. It looked utterly out of place, an intrusion from another time, another dimension, silent and imposing. It was too perfect, too smooth, too black. It absorbed the strange, pervasive light, creating a void, a stark contrast to the brilliant surroundings. My eyes struggled to find any distinguishing features on its surface, but there were none, just an oppressive, seamless blackness. It pulsed with a silent, menacing energy. This had to be what drew me here, not the trapper's cabin, which now felt like a child's forgotten fantasy, but this impossible structure in this impossible meadow. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee, to forget I had ever seen this place. But another, darker fascination pulled me forward. What was it? Who built it? How was it even here? My rational mind, though battered, still sought answers. Slowly, carefully, I started to walk towards the monolith, my steps hesitant, my eyes scanning my surroundings, trying to process the visual cacophony. On my left, I was walking through deep, crisp snow, each step crunching softly. On my right, I was stepping over vibrant spring growth, the soft earth yielding under my boots. The air on each side of my body was a constant, baffling contradiction of temperature and scent. I noticed a slight rise in the ground as I approached the center of the meadow. It wasn't a hill, more like a gentle swell leading up to the monolith. As I drew closer, perhaps 50 yards from the structure, I began to discern more details, or rather, the lack of them. The monolith was utterly devoid of any markings. No carvings, no doors, no windows. It was a pure, unadulterated block of obsidian-like stone, reflecting nothing, absorbing all light. It hummed not with a sound I could hear with my ears, but with a low, resonant vibration that I felt deep in my bones. It was a subtle thrum, a pressure in the air that spoke of immense, contained power. It felt alive. My breath hitched again. This was beyond anything I had ever imagined. The woods, which had always been my sanctuary, now held a secret so profound, so terrifying, that it threatened to unravel my sanity. As I stood there, mesmerized by the dark tower, a new phenomenon began to manifest around me. The seasonal divisions in the meadow, which had been so stark and absolute, began to shimmer and waver at their edges. It was subtle at first, like heat haze rising from a summer road. The line between winter and spring, between autumn and summer, started to blur. Then it accelerated. The colors became more fluid, bleeding into each other. A patch of snow would suddenly be dotted with green shoots, only to be replaced a moment later by the golden hues of fallen leaves. A blossoming flower might sprout icy crystals on its petals. The air itself swirled, hot and cold currents twisting around me, no longer separated but warring, creating a dizzying, disorienting kaleidoscope of sensations. The scent of pine, blooming flowers, damp earth, and snow merged into a confusing, overwhelming bouquet. It was as if the fabric of reality itself was coming undone, accelerated by my presence or perhaps by the tower's influence. My head reeled. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again, hoping it was an illusion. It wasn't. The swirling chaos only intensified. The ground under my feet began to feel unstable. It wasn't shaking, but its consistency changed erratically. One moment it was solid earth, the next it felt spongy, then icy, then brittle and dry. I stumbled, trying to regain my balance, my vision swimming. The overwhelming nature of the phenomenon was disorienting, but what happened next truly pushed me past the brink of mere confusion into abject terror. From the top of the monolith, which still pierced the luminous sky, a thin, black line began to descend. It wasn't a beam of light, it was a line of pure darkness, absorbing the pervasive glow of the meadow. It descended slowly, deliberately, growing thicker, wider, consuming the light as it fell, like an inverted laser beam made of shadow. It moved without sound, without displacement of air, an impossible descent of absolute void. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the rising tide of panic. My breath caught in my throat. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, to get away from this impossible, terrifying sight. But my feet remained rooted to the ground, heavy and unresponsive, as if encased in lead. The black line descended, slowly, inexorably, until it was just above the ground, forming a perfect, inky circle around the base of the monolith, perhaps 30 feet in diameter. It looked like a hole torn in reality, a patch of absolute nothingness. And as soon as it settled, the shimmering, swirling chaos of the seasons around me ceased. Everything went still. The air grew heavy, oppressive, thick with an unspoken threat. The impossible light of the meadow dimmed just slightly, as if drawing inward, making the monolith's black circle appear even more profound, even more menacing. And then, from within the circle of shadow, something began to emerge. It wasn't a creature, not in any sense I understood. It was a distortion, a ripple in the air, a place where the light seemed to bend and twist, forming a vaguely humanoid shape. It was tall, impossibly slender, and seemed to be made of pure, shifting shadow. It had no discernible features, no face, no limbs in the traditional sense, just an elongated, ethereal form that flowed and coalesced, yet somehow held its shape. It moved with a silent, unnatural grace, gliding out of the black circle, its formless body seeming to absorb even the faint light around it. It felt less like it was walking and more like it was simply being, a hole in the world made manifest. A chilling silence fell over the meadow, broken only by the frantic beat of my own heart. It stopped at the edge of the black circle, its formless head tilting, as if observing me. There were no eyes, no discernible sensory organs, yet I felt its gaze, a prickling sensation on my skin, a deep, unsettling awareness that it was seeing into me, beyond my physical presence, into my very core. My mouth was dry, my throat constricted. I wanted to scream, to cry out, but no sound escaped. My entire body trembled uncontrollably, a visceral response to the pure, unadulterated terror radiating from this impossible entity. I remembered stories, campfire tales of ancient evils in the deep woods, of things that lurked beyond human comprehension. I'd always scoffed at them, dismissed them as fantasy. Now I stood face to face with one. The shadow creature began to move again, gliding towards me, its form flickering at the edges like a disturbed flame. It didn't rush, didn't threaten with overt aggression. Its movement was slow, deliberate, a horrifying inevitability. Each silent, gliding step felt like a drumbeat of dread. I finally found my voice, a pathetic gasp, a raw, strangled sound that died in the heavy air. My legs, still trembling, finally obeyed. I turned not towards the thicket where I'd entered, but blindly towards the nearest edge of the meadow, towards what looked like a dense wall of trees. My only thought was escape. Run, get away, now. I sprinted, my lungs burning, my vision blurred by adrenaline and fear. I didn't care where I was going, only that I was moving away from the thing, away from the monolith, away from the impossible meadow. The ground beneath my feet continued its disorienting dance of seasons. The snow, the spring earth, the autumn leaves, now a confusing, dangerous obstacle course as I stumbled and scrambled. I could feel its presence behind me, a cold void that seemed to suck the warmth and sound from the air. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, pushing my body to its absolute limits, fueled by a terror that was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The trees that ringed the meadow, which had looked so normal from the outside, now seemed impossibly far away, an ever-receding line of safety. My mind was a chaotic mess. The woods, my sanctuary, had betrayed me. It had lured me into a trap, into a place of nightmares. The silence of the chase was the most terrifying aspect. No footfalls, no rustling, just the profound, unsettling quiet of the shadow figure, punctuated only by my own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of my blood in my ears. I reached the tree line, scrambling through a thicket of young hemlocks, their rough branches tearing at my jacket, scratching my face. I barely registered the pain. All that mattered was putting distance between myself and that thing. I burst through the other side, expecting to find the familiar woods, the dappled light of late afternoon, the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. Instead, I found myself in another clearing. This one was smaller, perhaps only 100 yards across, but just as impossible. The air here was still and heavy, devoid of any scent. The light was duller, a perpetual twilight that offered no solace. The ground was not earth, but a strange, gray, compacted dust devoid of any vegetation, and the trees that surrounded it were unlike any I had ever seen. They were tall, skeletal, their branches twisting upwards like grasping claws, completely bare of leaves, their bark a uniform, unsettling black. My heart sank with a leaden despair. I hadn't escaped. I had simply run from one nightmare into another, a different kind of horror, perhaps worse in its bleak, desolate silence. The sense of isolation here was absolute, crushing. And in the center of this new, desolate clearing stood another monolith. Smaller than the first, perhaps only 30 feet tall, but just as black, just as seamless, just as alien. It didn't hum, but it radiated an intense cold, a feeling of deep, ancient sorrow that settled over me like a shroud. I stood there panting, my hands on my knees, staring at this new structure, this new impossible landscape. Had I run in a circle? Was this some cruel trick? Or had I passed through some unseen portal, transported to a different corner of this impossible reality? Then I heard it, a sound, faint but distinct, coming from the black monolith. It was a whisper, a low, sibilant hiss that seemed to emanate from the stone itself, from the very air around it. It wasn't in a language I recognized, but it carried an unmistakable tone of ancient malice, of profound despair. It was a sound that seemed to crawl inside my head, chilling me to the bone. My eyes darted back to the clearing I had just fled. Was the shadow creature still there? Was it following? I didn't know, and I didn't want to find out. This new horror, this whispering monolith, was enough to contend with. A new kind of fear began to bloom in my chest, more insidious than the primal terror of the shadow. This was the fear of being truly lost, truly trapped in a place that defied all understanding, a place where sanity itself seemed to be under attack. I looked around the gray clearing, desperate for a way out. The black skeletal trees stood like silent judges, offering no comfort, no familiar landmarks. There were no trails, no signs of life, just the gray dust and the whispering monolith. My phone, I remembered my phone, my last link to the world I knew. With trembling hands, I pulled it from my day pack. The screen flickered to life, showing the time, 5:17 p.m. A few minutes had passed since I entered the first meadow, but the GPS, I opened the mapping app. The screen was blank, no satellite signal, not even a faint trace. Just a black background with a tiny blinking dot where my location should be, hovering over an endless void. My heart sank further. My most reliable tool useless, my lifeline severed. I tried to call out, a desperate hoarse shout. "Hello, is anyone there?" The words felt flat, swallowed by the oppressive silence, dying almost immediately. There was no echo, no response, just the faint, incessant whisper from the monolith. I pressed myself against one of the black trees, its rough, cold bark offering little comfort. I slid down, collapsing onto the gray dust, my head spinning. What was happening to me? Was I losing my mind? I closed my eyes, trying to force myself back to the cabin, to the smell of pine and coffee, to the familiar screen of my computer. But the images of the impossible meadow, the swirling seasons, the silent shadow, and now this desolate gray clearing and the whispering monolith were burned into my mind. I was trapped, truly, utterly trapped, and the whispering from the monolith seemed to grow louder, more insistent, though still incomprehensible. It felt like it was trying to communicate, trying to draw me in, to impart some ancient, terrible secret. I resisted, pressing my hands over my ears, but the sound seemed to come from within, a resonance in my bones. My gaze fell on my camera, still hanging around my neck. A flicker of something, defiance, desperation, ignited within me. Proof. I needed proof. If I ever got out of this, no one would believe me. Maybe taking pictures, recording what I saw would ground me, connect me to reality. With a shaky hand, I raised the camera. I pointed it at the whispering monolith, then at the skeletal trees, then at the gray dust. Click, click, click. The sound of the shutter was a comforting, mechanical presence in the oppressive quiet. I reviewed the images on the small screen. The monolith was just a black shape, fuzzy and indistinct. The trees looked like shadows. The gray dust was a blank field. The bizarre light in the first meadow had clearly messed with the camera's sensor, or perhaps this place simply refused to be captured accurately. Even if the images were clear, they wouldn't convey the profound, unsettling wrongness of it all, the sensory assault, the bone-deep dread. My desperate act of documentation felt futile. This place defied capture, defied understanding. It was too alien, too impossible. As I lowered the camera, my eyes caught a glint of something in the gray dust near the base of the monolith. It was small, metallic, partially buried. With a morbid curiosity, I crawled closer, pushing aside the gritty dust with my fingers. It was a compass, an old brass compass, its casing tarnished, its glass cracked. But the needle of the needle was spinning wildly, erratically, no longer pointing north, but rotating in a frantic, meaningless dance, as if lost in a magnetic storm of impossible proportions. I picked it up, feeling the cold weight of it in my palm. It was a poignant symbol of my situation. Lost, irreparably lost. I looked back at the ring of black trees, trying to discern the direction I had come from. Was there a path, a break in the strange vegetation? Everything looked the same, a seamless wall of twisted, dark branches and bark. I was surrounded, enclosed by this new, bleak landscape. The whispering from the monolith grew louder, a chorus of sibilant, overlapping voices that seemed to resonate with my rising panic. It felt like they were calling to me, drawing me closer, promising answers, or perhaps just oblivion. My head began to throb with the effort of resisting its insidious pull. I had to move. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let this place, these impossible sounds, break me. With a grunt, I pushed myself to my feet, my legs still wobbly, my body protesting. I picked a direction at random, towards what looked like the least dense part of the tree line, and began to walk. Each step kicked up a puff of gray dust. The silence pressed in, broken only by the incessant, maddening whispers and my own ragged breathing. The air was cold, dry, devoid of any natural scent. It felt like walking on the surface of a dead planet. As I neared the tree line, the whispers from the monolith intensified, forming a disorienting, undulating wave of sound that seemed to buffet me. It was like 1,000 tiny voices, all speaking at once, yet somehow forming a single, coherent, maddening drone. My temples pounded, my vision blurred at the edges. I stumbled through the dark, skeletal trees, pushing aside their brittle, claw-like branches. They offered no resistance, their wood dry and unnaturally light. They seemed to part for me, almost inviting me further into their desolate realm. I felt a growing sense of despair, an overwhelming certainty that I would never find my way back, that this was my new reality. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, I broke through the black trees and found myself somewhere else entirely. This clearing was vibrant, almost blindingly so. The light here was a golden, shimmering haze, infused with a dizzying array of colors that shifted and pulsed like a slow-motion aurora borealis. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and something sweet like burnt sugar. The ground was covered in a carpet of luminous, phosphorescent moss that glowed with an internal light, casting strange, shifting patterns of green and blue. The trees here were tall, graceful, their bark a pearlescent white, their leaves a translucent, iridescent silver that shimmered with every imperceptible breeze. Everything glowed, pulsed, shimmered with an inner light, creating a dizzying, beautiful, and utterly alien landscape. And in the center of this glowing clearing stood yet another monolith. This one was different. It was smaller still, perhaps 20 feet tall, and made of a crystalline, iridescent material that seemed to catch and refract the light, sending dazzling rainbows spiraling through the air. It wasn't black or gray. It was a prism of shifting colors, constantly changing, constantly alive. It pulsed with a soft, warm light of its own, a gentle thrumming that was felt more than heard, resonating deep in my chest. My mind, already frayed at the edges, struggled to cope. 3 clearings, 3 monoliths, each one a complete, inexplicable shift in reality. It was too much. The sheer impossibility of it all threatened to snap my last remaining tether to sanity. I stared at the crystalline monolith, its surface swirling with internal light, its warmth a stark contrast to the desolate cold of the previous clearing. It felt ancient, but also gentle, almost benevolent, a strange, beautiful counterpart to the oppressive blackness of the first 2. As I approached it, drawn by an irresistible curiosity, I noticed something etched into its shimmering surface. Not carvings, but symbols, intricate and flowing, glowing faintly with an inner light. They were unlike any language or script I had ever seen, yet they seemed to hum with meaning, to resonate with a quiet power. My fingers hovered over one of the glowing symbols, tempted to touch it, to feel its energy. A sudden, sharp memory flashed through my mind. My grandmother, a woman who had always told me stories of ancient magic and hidden worlds, stories I had dismissed as charming folklore. She had spoken of places between worlds, where time and space twisted, where the veil between realities was thin. She'd always warned me to be careful in the deep woods, to respect the old places, the places that felt wrong. I had scoffed then, I wasn't scoffing now. This was one of those places, not just wrong, but fundamentally, impossibly right in its wrongness. It was a place designed to break the mind, to redefine reality. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. Panic wouldn't help me. I needed to think, to analyze, to somehow find a pattern, a way out of this impossible labyrinth. 3 clearings, 3 monoliths, they had to be connected. Each one felt like a different facet of some grand alien design. The glowing moss underfoot felt soft, almost alive, yielding slightly with each step. The air was strangely invigorating, despite the overwhelming strangeness. I touched the bark of one of the pearlescent trees. It was smooth, cool, and emitted a faint, almost imperceptible warmth. These trees felt peaceful, ancient, observant. I turned my attention back to the crystalline monolith. The symbols on its surface seemed to pulse, to shift, almost as if they were trying to communicate with me. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me in this clearing, a temporary reprieve from the terror that had gripped me in the others. It was a beautiful horror, a serene madness. But the calmness was fleeting. A small, chilling detail caught my eye as I looked down at the base of the crystalline monolith. Embedded in the glowing moss, partially obscured, were a series of small, metallic objects. I knelt, pushing aside the luminous greenery. They were scattered around the base, perhaps 20 or so. And as I picked one up, a wave of profound despair washed over me, colder and deeper than any physical chill. They were dog tags. Not military dog tags, but the kind you put on a pet, engraved with names and dates. The one I held read, Buddy, missing 9/14/2007. I picked up another, Daisy, missing 4/21/2012. Then another Rex, missing 11/02/2001. My fingers trembled as I picked up more. Mittens, missing 7/07/2015. Shadow, missing 3/10/2005. They weren't all for pets. Some were small metal charms, the kind people put on keychains. One had a child's name, Emily, and a faded date, missing 10/19/1998. Another was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, clearly a homemade charm, also with a date, missing 6/03/1991. And then, perhaps the most chilling discovery of all. Beneath a thick clump of glowing moss, I found a small, dark leather wallet. It was old, weathered, but still intact. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside, there was an expired driver's license. The picture showed a man, perhaps in his late 40s, with kind eyes and a receding hairline. His name was Thomas Miller, and beneath it, a date of birth and then a faint, handwritten note on the license itself, scrawled in faded ink, missing 8/11/2003. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a place of impossible seasons and silent horrors. This was a trap, a graveyard. The missing dates spanned decades, even back into the late 20th century. People and their beloved pets had wandered into these woods, perhaps strayed off-trail just like me, and ended up here. They had become lost, irretrievably so, their last lingering possessions left at the foot of this beautiful, terrible monolith. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't just lost, I was another addition to this collection of the disappeared. These items weren't left here deliberately. They were dropped, forgotten, lost in the desperation of people who had given up hope. The fear, which had momentarily receded in the strange beauty of this clearing, returned with a vengeance, colder and more profound than ever before. This was not a temporary disorientation. This was a permanent state. This was where things came to be forgotten, to cease to exist in the world I knew. I looked around at the shimmering, glowing clearing, at the pearlescent trees, at the crystalline monolith. It was a prison disguised as a miracle, a beautiful, luminous cage from which there was no escape. I thought of my cabin, my quiet life, my friends, my family. They would report me missing. Search parties would go out, but they would never find me. They would never find this place. I would simply vanish, another statistic, another mystery. The air in this clearing, once so invigorating, now felt heavy, charged with the echoes of despair from all those who had passed through here before me. The gentle thrum of the monolith now felt like a dirge, a silent lament for the lost. I had to find a way out. I refused to become another name, another date left at the foot of an alien monument. I wouldn't give up. Not yet. I stood up, my gaze sweeping the perimeter of the luminous clearing, searching for any anomaly, any sign of a path, anything that might hint at a direction. But the pearlescent trees formed a seamless wall, shimmering and impassable. The light made it impossible to discern depth or distance, blurring the edges of my perception. I clenched my fists, the dog tags and Thomas Miller's wallet still clutched in one hand. I would not succumb. I would fight. I would find a way. My eyes landed on my day pack. Water, energy bars, multi-tool. These were my anchors, my tools for survival in the wilderness I thought I knew. Here, they felt woefully inadequate, pathetic defenses against impossible realities, but they were all I had. I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to push down the rising tide of panic. My mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. I needed to retrace my steps, to go back through the gray clearing, and then, if I could find it, back through the terrifying multi-seasonal meadow. Maybe there was a portal, a specific point of entry and exit. Maybe the monoliths were markers or keys. It was a desperate hope, a fragile thread of sanity, but it was all I had left. With renewed resolve, I turned towards the direction I believed I had entered this glowing clearing, steeling myself for the desolate whispers and cold dread of the gray clearing, and then the overwhelming sensory assault of the first monstrous meadow. The thought of facing the shadow creature again sent a fresh wave of terror through me, but the alternative, becoming a permanent fixture in this impossible graveyard, was infinitely worse. I took one last look at the crystalline monolith, at the glowing symbols, at the dog tags and forgotten charms. A silent promise formed in my mind. If I ever made it out, I would find a way to honor these lost souls. I would tell their story. I wouldn't let them be forgotten. Then I turned and walked towards the shimmering barrier of pearlescent trees, bracing myself for whatever horror awaited me on the other side. This nightmare was far from over. I pushed through the shimmering, pearlescent trees, their smooth white bark cool beneath my trembling hands. The luminous moss underfoot seemed to dim slightly as I passed, as if mourning my departure from its gentle, beautiful prison. The air grew heavier, cooler, the scent of ozone and burnt sugar replaced by a chilling void. The warm, inviting hum of the crystalline monolith faded behind me, quickly swallowed by a familiar, oppressive silence. Then the gray, the world drained of color, of light, of life. The perpetual twilight of the desolate clearing settled over me like a suffocating blanket. The ground beneath my boots was the same compacted, lifeless dust, fine and gritty, kicking up tiny clouds with each step. The skeletal trees, their black branches twisted like grasping claws, stood in silent judgment, their bare limbs reaching towards the dull, featureless sky. The cold radiated from the very ground, seeping into my bones, a stark contrast to the fleeting warmth of the previous clearing. And then the whisper. It began subtly at first, a faint, sibilant hiss, a collective murmur of ancient voices worming its way into my mind. It wasn't loud, but it was insistent, a maddening drone that felt less like a sound and more like a vibration in my very skull. It was the same sound, the same profound despair, the same insidious malice I'd fled from before. The black monolith loomed in the center of the clearing, a silent, imposing sentinel, radiating its intense cold and broadcasting its incomprehensible chorus of whispers. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the drone in my head. I still clutched the dog tags and Thomas Miller's wallet in my hand, their cold metal a stark reminder of what awaited me if I failed. I wouldn't fail. I couldn't. I forced myself to walk, aiming for where I thought the entrance to the first multi-seasonal meadow would be, but the gray clearing was disorienting. The black trees formed a seamless wall, offering no distinguishing features, no landmarks. The uniform dull light erased all depth perception. Every direction looked the same, a featureless, hostile expanse. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw its way back up my throat. I stopped, spinning slowly, trying to reorient myself. The whispering grew louder, a wave of disembodied voices pressing in from all sides. It felt like they were talking to me, or perhaps through me, their words a torrent of non-language that promised only madness. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my hands over my ears, but it was no use. The sound was internal, a resonance within my very bones, an assault on my sanity. "Stop!" I yelled, my voice raw and hoarse, swallowed instantly by the oppressive silence of the clearing and the relentless whispers. "Leave me alone." My words were pathetic, futile. The whispers continued, unwavering. I opened my eyes, scanning the desolate landscape. I needed a plan, just blindly rushing forward wouldn't work. I had to assume that the portals between clearings were specific, not just any random point in the tree line. The monoliths. They had to be the key, the anchor points of these impossible realities. I looked at the black monolith, its dark surface absorbing the already dim light. It was the source of the whispers, the core of this desolate realm. Could I interact with it? Could I force it to show me the way? The thought was terrifying, but the alternative was to wander aimlessly until I succumbed to the whispers and became another lost soul. Taking a deep, shaky breath, I started walking towards the black monolith. Each step felt heavy, burdened by an invisible weight. The gray dust puffed around my boots, settling on my clothes, coating my skin. The cold intensified with every foot of progress, gnawing at my resolve. The whispers surged, becoming a cacophony, 1,000 voices screaming ancient, terrible secrets directly into my brain, yet still without discernible words. My head throbbed, a relentless pounding behind my eyes. As I neared the base of the monolith, the sense of ancient sorrow intensified, mingling with an overwhelming feeling of profound loneliness. This place wasn't just cold, it was utterly devoid of hope, a realm of forgotten despair. I could feel the energy emanating from the monolith, not a hum like the first, nor a warmth like the third, but a profound, chilling emptiness that threatened to drag me down into its silent abyss. I stood before its seamless black surface, close enough to touch it. It was impossibly smooth, colder than ice. No markings, no seams, nothing to suggest a way in or out, just pure, unadulterated blackness absorbing all light, all hope. The whispers crescendoed, a deafening roar in my head, a storm of madness. My vision blurred, tears stinging my eyes, though whether from the cold or the sheer mental strain I couldn't tell. I felt my grip on reality slipping, a terrifying sensation of being unmoored, disconnected from everything I knew. Then a flicker, not of light, but of absence of light on the surface of the monolith. A ripple, a distortion in the blackness, like ink swirling in dark water. It started small, near the bottom, and began to slowly expand upwards. I instinctively recoiled, my heart leaping into my throat. What was happening? Was it opening? Was it seeing me? The distortion grew, becoming a swirling vortex of deeper blackness on the monolith's surface. It wasn't a physical opening, but a visual anomaly, a portal made of pure void, and within its depths I saw glimpses, fleeting images like frames from an ancient, forgotten film. I saw the multi-seasonal meadow, but distorted, warped. The seasons weren't divided, they were melting, running together in a chaotic mess of mud, melting snow, and rotting flowers. I saw the shadow creature, not gliding silently, but flailing, twisting, its formless body struggling against an unseen force, contorting into impossible shapes, its non-existent features radiating pure agony. Then the images shifted. I saw glimpses of my own world. My cabin, but overlaid with grime and cobwebs, abandoned, decaying. I saw my computer screen, but covered in static, then filled with distorted, screaming faces that weren't there. I saw my own reflection, but older, gaunt, eyes wide with a terror that mirrored my own, but infinitely deeper, hinting at decades of being lost. The whispers intensified with each image, lashing out at me, driving nails into my mind. It was a projection of despair, a vision of my own inevitable fate if I stayed here. This wasn't a way out, it was a warning, a psychological attack designed to break me. I clenched my jaw, fighting against the overwhelming assault. I wouldn't give in. I tore my gaze away from the swirling vortex, forcing myself to look at the ground, at the dust, at anything but the horrifying visions. "No," I whispered, then louder, "no, I won't let you break me." I turned and fled, not caring about direction, only about putting distance between myself and the whispering monolith. I ran blindly through the gray clearing, the dust kicking up around my boots, the skeletal trees blurring into a dark, menacing wall. The whispers pursued me, a relentless mental assault, a constant drone that made my teeth ache and my head swim. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs screamed in protest, until I stumbled and fell, skinning my hands on the rough, gritty ground. I lay there for a moment, gasping, shaking, the dog tags digging into my palm. I refused to give up. I forced myself to sit up, then slowly, agonizingly pushed myself to my feet. I had to find a different way. There had to be an exit. The monoliths were connected, but perhaps they weren't the only way through. I looked around the desolate clearing, my eyes narrowed, trying to find anything, any anomaly. The black trees, the gray dust, the dull light, it was all uniform, featureless. But wait. As my eyes adjusted, as my mind tried to filter out the maddening whispers, I noticed something. The black trees, they weren't entirely uniform. Some were thicker, more gnarled, their branches reaching further. And one, directly opposite from where I now stood relative to the monolith, seemed to have a slightly different hue to its bark, a deeper, almost metallic sheen. It was subtle, easily missed in the dim light, but it was there. And unlike the others, which seemed to grow straight up, its trunk twisted into a slight spiral at its base, almost like a faint, upward-pointing arrow. It was a sign, a marker, or maybe just wishful thinking, but it was something. With renewed, desperate hope, I started walking towards that tree, ignoring the whispers that continued to batter my mind. My steps were more deliberate now, my gaze fixed on that subtle anomaly. As I got closer, the metallic sheen became more evident and the spiral twist in the bark more pronounced. It felt different. It felt like a threshold. I reached the tree, placing my hand on its cold, hard bark. It felt different from the others, a faint vibration under my palm, a resonance that was distinct from the monolith's whispers. It was a quiet hum, a subtle thrum that felt anticipatory. I pushed through the twisted branches, ignoring the scratches on my face and hands. They parted easily, unnaturally so, as if welcoming me. And just like before, I stepped through an unseen veil. The oppressive silence of the gray clearing shattered. The constant, maddening whispers ceased instantly, leaving behind a ringing echo in my ears. The cold vanished, replaced by a chaotic swirl of temperatures. The dull, uniform twilight dissolved into a dizzying kaleidoscope of shifting, swirling light. I was back in the first meadow, the impossible, multi-seasonal one. My senses were immediately assaulted. On my left, the biting cold of winter, the scent of fresh snow and crisp pine. On my right, the gentle warmth of spring, the rich, humid scent of blooming wildflowers and damp earth. In front of me, the crisp, golden-brown detritus of autumn leaves, carrying the unmistakable scent of wood smoke and decaying foliage. The air was a maelstrom of conflicting temperatures and aromas, a dizzying, disorienting sensory overload. My eyes darted around. The seasonal divisions, which had shimmered and blurred during my first encounter with the shadow creature, were now starkly, violently defined. Winter was a pristine, snow-covered expanse, the pines heavy and still. Spring was a riot of color, a vibrant tapestry of flowers and lush green grass. Autumn was a golden sea of fallen leaves rustling in an unseen breeze. And summer, which I hadn't explicitly noticed before, was now clearly delineated directly opposite the winter section, a sun-drenched patch of tall, waving grasses and ripening berries. The meadow was now a perfect quartered circle, each section a distinct, vibrant season. And in the very center, the black monolith loomed as silent and imposing as I remembered. But the black circle it had created, the inky void from which the shadow creature had emerged, was gone. The base of the monolith was simply ringed by the convergence of the four seasons, each one bleeding right up to its seamless obsidian surface. A fresh wave of terror washed over me. The shadow creature, where was it? I scanned the meadow frantically, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The light, that impossibly bright, diffused glow, made shadows soft and indistinct, but I could see no movement, no shimmering distortion, no hole in reality. The meadow was still, beautiful, and utterly terrifying. The silence here, though less oppressive than the gray clearing, was still unnatural. No birdsong, no rustling of unseen animals, just the conflicting breezes and the subtle sounds of each season, the imagined crunch of snow, the whisper of leaves, the hum of invisible bees. I had to find the exit, the thicket I'd stumbled through initially, the one that had led me into this nightmare. I turned towards the edge of the meadow, trying to retrace my steps. But the trees that ringed the clearing, mostly hemlock and birch, seemed to stretch into an infinite, shifting wall. The pervasive light made depth perception difficult, and the various seasonal landscapes made finding a fixed point impossible. One moment I was looking at snow-covered evergreens, the next they were verdant with spring growth, then tinged with autumn colors. I took a tentative step forward, my left foot sinking into the soft, cool earth of spring, my right hovering over the brittle, yellowed grass of winter. The contradiction was still jarring, still profoundly wrong. "Which way?" I muttered to myself, my voice thin and reedy in the vast silence. I decided to circle the perimeter, keeping the monolith in sight as my central anchor point. Perhaps the exit was marked or felt different, like the twisted tree in the gray clearing. I began to walk, my steps careful, my senses on high alert. I tried to focus, to calm my frantic mind, to observe. The ground shifted constantly beneath my feet, soft spring earth, then crunching autumn leaves, then damp summer soil, then biting winter snow. Each step was a physical and mental challenge. As I walked, I began to notice something else. Small, subtle movements at the very edges of my peripheral vision. Flickers like heat haze at the border where the trees met the meadow. I would turn my head quickly, but nothing would be there, just the seamless wall of shifting trees. It felt like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. It wasn't the constant, oppressive gaze of the shadow creature, but a more diffuse, pervasive awareness, as if the meadow itself was observing me, or something within the trees. I continued my slow, methodical circuit, my eyes darting from the trees to the monolith, then across the impossible seasonal landscapes. I felt a growing sense of dread, a chilling certainty that the longer I stayed here, the more likely I was to encounter something truly terrible. My pace quickened, but the tree line seemed to recede with every step. I was running, but not moving. It was an illusion, a trick of the light, or perhaps the nature of this place. The boundaries of the meadow seemed to stretch, expanding as I tried to reach them. Frustration, hot and bitter, mixed with my terror. This place was actively mocking me, playing with my perception. I slammed my fist into my thigh. "Come on," I yelled, my voice cracking. "Let me out." My cry was met with only the conflicting breezes and the overwhelming, unnatural quiet. I stopped panting, leaning my hands on my knees. I closed my eyes, trying to clear my head. The fear was making me reckless, panicky. I needed to think to regain some control. When I opened my eyes, I saw it, not directly in front of me, but across the meadow near the winter section. The shadow creature. It had emerged from the ground, not from a black circle this time, but simply coalescing from the very air, its formless body twisting and stretching, absorbing the light. It was taller now, more defined, its vaguely humanoid shape more pronounced, though still devoid of features. It stood silently, impossibly still at the edge of the winter expanse, its formless head tilted slightly towards me, its unseen gaze pinning me to the spot. A fresh wave of pure, primal terror surged through me, colder and sharper than the winter air. My breath hitched, my heart pounded a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. It had found me, or perhaps it had been waiting. This time, it didn't immediately glide towards me. It simply stood there, observing, its silence more menacing than any roar. It felt like it was playing with me, a cat with a mouse, enjoying my fear. I had to move. I couldn't just stand here and be its prey. But where to go? Run back to the gray clearing? No, that was just another trap, a place of madness. My eyes darted to the black monolith in the center of the meadow. It felt like the eye of the storm, the nexus of all this impossible reality. What if it wasn't just a marker, but a source? What if interacting with it was the only way out? A desperate, terrifying thought began to form in my mind. What if I had to go to the monoliths? Every instinct screamed no. It was the source of the shadow creature, the heart of this terror. But what other choice did I have? Running around the perimeter was futile. The clearings were linked by the monoliths. Perhaps the first one was the ultimate key. I took a deep, shaky breath, forcing down the terror. My legs felt like lead, but I had to move. I started walking, not running, directly towards the black monolith. My eyes remained fixed on the shadow creature, which still stood motionless, observing my every move. As I walked, the seasons continued their dizzying dance around me. My left foot crunched on snow, my right sank into spring earth. The air swirled hot and cold, the sense a confusing, overwhelming bouquet. The constant sensory assault was disorienting, but I focused on the monolith, on my goal. 50 yards, 40, 30, I was getting closer. The shadow creature still hadn't moved. Its stillness was unnerving, more frightening than any chase. As I reached the point where the four seasons converged at the base of the monolith, I stopped. The black stone loomed over me, an oppressive, silent void. The air here was heavy, thick with an unseen pressure, a palpable sense of immense power. I looked at the shadow creature. It was still there, 100 yards away, unmoving, watching. It felt like a test. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears, in my throat. My hands trembled, my knees felt weak, but I had made it this far. I had faced the whispers, the despair, the beautiful horror of the crystal clearing. I wouldn't stop now. I reached out slowly, tentatively, towards the black monolith. My fingers brushed against its seamless surface. It was smooth, cold, impossibly dense. It felt ancient, eternal. As I touched it, a faint, almost imperceptible thrum resonated through my hand, up my arm, and into my chest. It wasn't the bone-shaking vibration from before, but a quieter, more focused energy. And then something happened. Not to the monolith, but to the meadow around me. The stark divisions of the seasons began to shimmer again, more violently than before. The snow on my left started to melt, revealing patches of green grass beneath. The spring flowers on my right began to wilt and freeze, covered in delicate hoarfrost. The autumn leaves turned verdant, then decayed into rich, dark soil. The summer grasses withered into brittle, yellow stalks. It was as if the internal clock of the meadow had gone mad, accelerating and reversing the cycle of seasons within moments. The air became a vortex of hot and cold, humid and dry. The scents churned into a dizzying, sickening mixture. My head reeled, my vision swam. I clutched the monolith, steadying myself against its cold, unyielding surface. This was not a pleasant change. This was a chaotic unraveling, a breakdown of the impossible order. And as the meadow convulsed in this temporal storm, the shadow creature began to move. It glided forward slowly at first, then picking up speed, its formless body flowing over the rapidly changing ground. It was coming for me. Its movement was still silent, still unnaturally graceful, but now there was a sense of inevitability, a predatory intent. I pulled my hand away from the monolith, my mind racing. What had I done? Had I triggered something? Had I woken it up? I backed away from the monolith, stumbling over the rapidly changing ground. The snow was now thick mud, the flowers were mush. My boots sank, making escape difficult. The shadow creature gained on me, its form flickering, growing larger, more menacing. I had to get out, but the perimeter of the meadow was still a shifting, unreachable wall. There was nowhere to run. As the shadow creature closed the distance, now only 50 yards away, its silent approach filled me with a terror that transcended any I had felt before. It was an ancient, unstoppable force, and I was utterly helpless. Just as it reached the 10-yard mark, its form distorting, stretching, almost reaching for me, a desperate, almost suicidal thought flashed through my mind. The camera. It was still hanging around my neck, proof, a record, maybe, just maybe, it could do something. It was a flimsy thought born of pure desperation, but it was all I had. With trembling hands, I raised the camera, pointing it directly at the approaching shadow creature. I didn't know what I hoped to achieve. Blindly, I pressed the shutter button. Click. The sound was sharp, mechanical, impossibly loud in the chaos of the meadow. It was a tiny, insignificant sound against the approaching horror, but it was a sound of defiance. And then something incredible happened. A blinding flash of light erupted from the camera lens, not a flash from the built-in flash, but a pure, intense burst of white light that seemed to draw from the pervasive glow of the meadow itself, amplifying it 1,000-fold. It was so bright it instantly burned out my vision, leaving me seeing nothing but spots and afterimages. A shriek, not a human shriek, not an animal sound, but a ripping, tearing sound, like fabric being violently torn, like reality itself was screaming. It was a sound of pure agony, of impossible pain, unlike anything I had ever heard. The pressure in the air vanished. The swirling temperatures, the clashing scents, the nauseating visual chaos of the seasons, it all stopped. Instantly. I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching the camera to my chest, my ears ringing with the echo of that impossible scream. My body trembled uncontrollably, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Slowly, tentatively, I opened my eyes. The meadow was still, perfectly still. The seasons were no longer in chaotic flux. They were back to their original, impossible, stark divisions. Winter, spring, summer, autumn, each perfectly delineated, each vibrant and distinct. The air was stable, the temperatures separated, the scents clear. The black monolith stood silently in the center, just as before. But the shadow creature was gone. Vanished completely, not a trace, not a ripple in the air, not a lingering void. It was as if it had never been there. The only evidence was the ringing in my ears and the faint scent of ozone that now permeated the air. I stood there panting, my legs threatening to give out, staring at the empty space where the creature had been. Had I destroyed it, banished it, or merely startled it? I didn't know, but the relief that washed over me was immense, staggering. My eyes fell on the camera still clutched in my hands. The lens was cracked, spider-webbed with tiny fractures, and a faint, smoky odor emanated from the casing. It felt warm, almost hot to the touch. It had taken a toll, but it had worked. Somehow, impossibly, it had worked. I looked back at the monolith. It was still there, silent, black, imposing. But now it seemed less menacing, more neutral, as if the primary threat had been removed. My mind, though still reeling, began to clear. I had a weapon, an impossible weapon, but a weapon nonetheless, and I had a momentary reprieve. I couldn't stay here. I had to find the way out. I looked at the ring of trees surrounding the meadow. They were still vast, still blurring at the edges, still offering no obvious path. But now, with the immediate threat gone, I felt a resurgence of my old instincts, my woodsman's intuition. The thicket, the dense patch of young birch and hemlock that I had pushed through to enter this meadow, it had felt distinct then. Could it still be distinct now? I started walking towards what I remembered as the general direction of my entry point. I didn't circle the perimeter this time, but walked in a straight line, cutting across the seasonal divides, trying to ignore the jarring changes underfoot. My eyes scanned the tree line, searching for any break, any sign of a familiar path, however faint. The light of the meadow, that pervasive, brilliant glow, seemed to soften as I approached the tree line. It was a subtle change, but noticeable. A hint of dappled light, of familiar shadows, began to emerge. Hope, a fragile, desperate thing, began to blossom in my chest. I pushed through the last line of evergreens, their needles scratching against my face and arms, but I barely registered the pain. And then I was out. The air hit me first, the crisp, cool air of late autumn, carrying the familiar scent of pine needles and damp earth. Not the conflicting maelstrom of the meadow, not the desolate cold of the gray clearing, not the ozone sweetness of the crystalline one. Just the familiar, comforting scent of the Adirondacks. The light was different too, not the blinding, pervasive glow, but the soft, golden light of late afternoon, filtered through the turning leaves, casting long, familiar shadows. I was back in the woods I knew. I stumbled, collapsing to my knees on a bed of pine needles and fallen leaves, burying my face in my hands, gasping for air that felt clean, real, breathable. Tears, hot and uncontrollable, streamed down my face. I was out. I was truly miraculously out. I raised my head, looking back at the spot where I had emerged. The trees were dense, impenetrable, a seamless wall of familiar green and gold. No sign of the meadow, no impossible light, no hint of the horrors I had just experienced. It was just woods, my woods. My entire body was shaking, my mind still reeling from the impossible journey. I touched my face, my hands, feeling the rough texture of my skin, the ache in my muscles, the cold autumn air on my cheeks. It was real. I was here. But the memory of it all was seared into my brain. The multi-seasonal meadow, the silent shadow, the gray clearing with its whispering monolith, the luminous, beautiful graveyard of the lost. The dog tag still clutched in my hand, the cracked camera around my neck, tangible proof that it hadn't been a dream, a hallucination. My phone, I pulled it from my day pack. The screen flickered to life, showing the time, 5:48 p.m. Less than an hour had passed, but the GPS, I opened the mapping app. And there it was, my tiny, blinking dot located firmly on a detailed topological map of the Adirondacks, somewhere off the marked trails about 10 miles from my cabin. The satellite signal was strong, clear, comforting, my lifeline reconnected. I had to get back, had to get home, my sanctuary. I stood up, my legs still wobbly, my body bruised and aching, my mind a chaotic mess of trauma and disbelief. But I was alive, I was back. I started walking, not running this time, but with a renewed sense of purpose, a desperate need for the familiar. I followed the deer trail, the one that had led me into this nightmare, but now it felt like a path to salvation. I was acutely aware of every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, every distant bird call. The woods that had once been my peace now held a deep, lingering terror. I didn't look back, I didn't dare. I just kept walking, one foot in front of the other, putting distance between myself and that God-forsaken place. My cabin was 10 miles away, a long walk even on a good day, and the sun was already dipping towards the horizon. I would be walking in the dark. But I would make it, I had to. As I walked, the events of the last hour replayed in my mind, a terrifying loop of impossible realities. The shadow creature, the whispers, the lost souls. I still clutched the dog tags and Thomas Miller's wallet in my hand. I hadn't forgotten them. I couldn't. I would reach my cabin, I would lock the doors, I would try to process what had happened. But I knew with a chilling certainty that my world had fundamentally changed. The wilderness, my sanctuary, now held a secret so profound, so terrifying, that it would forever haunt my dreams. I was out, but was I truly safe? Was it truly over? The cold bite of late autumn air on one cheek and the gentle warmth of spring on the other. It was a phantom sensation, a memory burned into my senses. Was it just a memory or a lingering echo? The sun dipped below the tree line, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples. The woods grew darker, the shadows longer, more indistinct. The sounds of the forest changed, the daytime chirps replaced by the calls of unseen nocturnal creatures. Every rustle, every creak of a branch made me jump. I kept walking, guided by the dim light of twilight, then by the pale glow of the rising moon. The exhaustion was setting in, deep and bone-wearying, but I couldn't stop. I had to reach the cabin, had to be enclosed by solid walls, by something familiar, something real. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably a few hours, I saw the faint, comforting glow of my cabin light through the trees. It was a beacon, a promise of safety, of normalcy. I pushed through the last stretch of woods, breaking out into my small clearing, stumbling towards the familiar porch. I fumbled with the key, my hands shaking so badly I could barely insert it into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing the warm, inviting interior of my home. I stepped inside, slamming the door shut and locking it with a final, desperate click. I leaned against the door, gasping for breath, my eyes scanning the familiar room, the worn armchair, the cluttered desk with my computer, the wood-burning stove. It was all there, untouched, real. I sank to the floor, my backpack sliding off my shoulders, scattering the dog tags and wallet across the wooden floorboards. The cracked camera still hung around my neck. I was home, I was safe. But as I sat there, curled against the door, the scent of pine and coffee mixed with the phantom smell of snow and blooming flowers, of wood smoke and ozone. And in the oppressive quiet of my cabin, I could still hear it, a faint, sibilant echo in the deep recesses of my mind, the whisper of the gray monolith. It wasn't over, not by a long shot undefined. The cabin's silence, once a comfort, now felt charged with the echoes of impossible places. I was home, yes, but the definition of home had fundamentally shifted. The familiar scent of pine and coffee fought a losing battle against the phantom smells of melting snow, blooming flowers, wood smoke, and ozone that clung to my senses, and the whispers. They were still there, a faint, sibilant echo deep in the recesses of my mind, a chilling reminder that the nightmare wasn't over. I lay on the floor, curled against the door, my body shaking uncontrollably. Every muscle ached, every nerve was frayed. My head throbbed, a dull, persistent pain behind my eyes. I pushed myself up, my movements slow and stiff, my limbs protesting with every flex. The scattered dog tags and Thomas Miller's wallet lay like grim confetti on the wooden floor. The cracked camera, my impossible weapon, still hung heavy around my neck. I crawled to the kitchen, my throat parched. I filled a glass with cold water from the tap, the familiar gurgle of the well pump a soothing, real sound. I drank it in long, desperate gulps, the cold liquid a shock to my system. I needed something more. I found a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey in the cupboard above the stove. I poured a generous amount into another glass, the amber liquid shimmering in the dim light of the cabin. It burned going down, but the warmth spread quickly through my chest, a temporary reprieve from the cold dread that still gripped me. I made my way back to the living room, gathering the scattered dog tags and the wallet. I sat heavily in my worn armchair, the familiar fabric a small comfort against my shaking body. I laid the items on the small table beside me, each one a stark, undeniable piece of evidence. I ran my fingers over Buddy's tag, then Daisy S, Rex's mittens, Shadow S, the names of lost pets, beloved companions who had simply vanished. Then Emily's charm, a child's name, and the wooden bird, a poignant, homemade tribute. Each one represented a life, a story, abruptly cut short, swallowed by that luminous, impossible graveyard. I opened Thomas Miller's wallet again. His driver's license photo stared back at me, a man with kind eyes, a gentle smile. Missing 8/11/2003. 20 years ago, he had walked into those woods just like me and never returned. His life, his hopes, his family, all lost, forgot, except for this faded piece of plastic and a scribbled note. A profound wave of sorrow washed over me, a chilling empathy for all those forgotten souls. I could have been one of them. I should have been one of them. My gaze drifted to the camera. The lens was indeed spiderwebbed with fractures, and the faint smell of ozone still clung to it. I gently took it off my neck, placing it on the table beside the wallet. What had happened? A flash of light, a scream, and then nothing. The creature simply ceased to exist. Was it destroyed, banished? What kind of energy did this camera tap into? It was an ordinary digital camera, a sturdy but unremarkable model I'd owned for years. There was nothing special about it, or was there? I remembered my grandmother's stories of magic, of things beyond human understanding. She had warned me about places between worlds, places where the veil between realities was thin. Could this camera be imbued with something, some unseen property, or had it just been a conduit for the chaotic energies of the meadow itself? The questions swirled in my mind, each one more bewildering than the last. I needed to make sense of this. I needed to document it, not just for proof, but for my own sanity. I stumbled over to my desk, my old desktop computer, a familiar, reassuring presence. I powered it on, the whirring of the fan a comforting mechanical drone. While it booted, I found my journal, a leather-bound notebook I used for tracking observations of wildlife and local flora. Today, it would be used for a very different kind of observation. My hand trembled as I uncapped my pen. I started writing, forcing myself to be precise, to recall every detail, no matter how impossible. The strange light, the shifting seasons, the terrifying shadow creature, the hum of the first monolith. Then the frantic escape, the gray clearing, the skeletal trees, the cold, the incessant, maddening whispers of the second monolith, the subtle anomaly of the twisted tree. Then the blinding, luminous beauty of the third clearing, the pearlescent trees, the crystalline monolith, and the horrifying discovery of the dog tags and Thomas Miller's wallet. The desperate return, the encounter with the shadow creature, the impossible flash of the camera, and the sudden, miraculous escape. I wrote for hours, the pen scratching furiously across the pages, filling them with words that felt inadequate to describe the sheer, unadulterated wrongness of it all. As I wrote, the memories solidified, became more real, more terrifying. The whispers, which had been a faint echo, seemed to grow stronger, a constant pressure at the back of my mind. The cabin, once a haven, now felt like a fragile barrier against an encroaching nightmare. By the time the first rays of dawn filtered through the window, painting the room in soft hues of orange and pink, I had filled dozens of pages. My hand ached, my eyes burned, and exhaustion weighed heavily on me, but my mind was still racing. I had laid out the facts, as impossible as they were. But what did it mean? What was this place? Why me? I pushed away from the desk, standing stiffly. The cabin was cold. The fire in the wood-burning stove had died hours ago. I needed to restart it, to bring some warmth back into this space. The mundane act of chopping wood, of coaxing a flame, felt grounding, a tether to the familiar world. As I worked, stacking kindling, arranging logs, my mind continued its frantic analysis. The monoliths, 3 of them each in a different clearing, each representing a different aspect of this impossible reality. The first, black silent, the anchor of the chaotic meadow, the source of the shadow creature. The second, black whispering, a realm of despair and cold. The third, crystalline, beautiful, a luminous prison for the lost. They were connected. I had moved between them through their associated landscapes by finding specific points of transition. And the camera, it was key. It had banished the shadow creature. What exactly was that thing? A guardian? A manifestation of the monolith's power? A predator? I didn't know, but the camera had worked against it. It wasn't just a record-keeping device anymore. It was a tool, perhaps the only tool I had. I finished with the fire, the crackling flames a welcome sight, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The warmth began to spread slowly through the cabin. I brewed some strong coffee, the rich aroma a comforting balm. I sat back in my armchair, sipping the coffee, the journal open on my lap. The dog tags and wallet were still on the table. The cracked camera stared up at me. I picked it up, examining the fractured lens. It looked broken, unusable, but it had just performed an impossible feat. Could it still work? I pressed the power button. Nothing. The screen remained black. I tried again. Still nothing. My heart sank. Had it been a one-time thing? A final, desperate act of defiance before its internal mechanisms gave out. I remembered the faint, smoky odor. It had been hot. Maybe it just needed to cool down, or perhaps it was out of power. I opened the battery compartment. The battery pack was swollen, deformed, almost fused to the casing. No wonder it wouldn't power on. The impossible flash must have overloaded it, drawing an incredible amount of energy. I carefully, painstakingly managed to pry the battery out. It was hot, even now, hours later. I held it up to the light. It was ruined. But the camera itself, other than the cracked lens, seemed intact. If I could get a new battery, would it work again? I had spare batteries for my camera, stored in a small waterproof case in my day pack. I rummaged through my day pack, finding the case. Inside were 2 fresh, fully charged battery packs. I took one out, a surge of cautious hope rising within me. I carefully inserted it into the camera. It clicked into place. I pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life. The lens, despite its spiderwebbed fractures, whirred, attempting to focus. The display showed the last image taken, a blinding white flash. Then it settled back into normal camera mode. It worked. It actually worked. The cracked lens would probably distort images, but the core functionality seemed intact. A new sense of resolve, cold and hard, began to solidify within me. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I had fought back. I had survived. And I had a weapon. I couldn't just stay here, hiding in my cabin, waiting for the whispers to drive me mad or for some unseen horror to find me. The thought that those impossible clearings might expand, might eventually encompass my familiar woods, sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't just about my survival anymore. It was about understanding, about finding a way to stop it, to prevent others from falling victim to it. Thomas Miller, Emily, Buddy, Daisy, they deserved more than to be forgotten. I made a decision. I had to go back. The thought was terrifying, bordering on suicidal. Every fiber of my being screamed against it. But what choice did I have? Live in perpetual fear? Become a prisoner in my own home? The allure of understanding, of fighting back, was a powerful counterweight to the terror. I wouldn't go back unprepared. I would plan. I would equip myself. First, information. I sat down at my computer. Google, the internet, my reliable portal to all human knowledge. I typed in missing persons Adirondacks unexplained. Then strange clearings, impossible phenomena. Page after page of news articles, local legends, forums dedicated to cryptids and conspiracy theories. Nothing that quite fit, nothing that offered real answers. The vast majority were old, unsolved disappearances, sad, mundane tragedies. No mention of multi-seasonal meadows or whispering monoliths. Whatever this place was, it was truly hidden. I remembered my grandmother's stories again. She had spoken of the old ones, of ancient powers dwelling in the deep places of the earth. She had always said that these places would only reveal themselves to those who were ready or those who were lost. I was definitely lost. I spent the rest of the morning and afternoon immersing myself in old folklore texts, local histories, even some fringe science articles about wormholes and dimensional shifts. It was a desperate attempt to find any common ground, any shred of information that could illuminate the impossible. I found nothing concrete, only vague allusions to liminal spaces, places where the boundaries between worlds were thin. It all felt like grasping at straws, trying to fit an alien puzzle into a familiar framework. As evening approached, the lingering whispers in my mind seemed to intensify, a subtle pressure, a quiet hum that made my teeth ache. I pulled out a map of the Adirondacks, a detailed topographical map I had used countless times for hiking. I tried to pinpoint where I thought the clearings were. My GPS had shown me about 10 miles from the cabin when I emerged. I marked that spot. Then, using the sun's position and the general direction I had run, I tried to estimate my original entry point into the first meadow. It was rough, approximate, but it was a starting point. The area I had marked was deep within the wilderness, far from any established trails or roads. It was exactly the kind of remote, untamed land where such a phenomenon could exist, hidden from human eyes. I ate a quick, unappetizing meal, my stomach churning with anxiety. Then I began to prepare. My day pack, already packed for my original hike, needed to be augmented. I added a heavy-duty flashlight with spare batteries, a first aid kit, a compass. Though I knew it wouldn't work in that place, it was a familiar comfort. A multi-tool, a hunting knife, rope, fire-starting materials, extra high-energy food bars, and a large canteen of water. I grabbed my old hunting rifle from the cabinet above the fireplace, checked its chamber, and loaded it with a full magazine. It felt ridiculously out of place in this context, a primitive tool against cosmic horror, but it was a weapon, and it offered a small measure of psychological reassurance. The camera, with its new battery and cracked lens, I hung securely around my neck. It was my primary weapon, my only defense against the shadow creature. I also packed a small, rugged digital voice recorder. If the camera couldn't capture images clearly, perhaps a sonic record of the whispers of the meadow's sounds would prove something. I didn't forget the dog tags or Thomas Miller's wallet. I carefully placed them inside a sealed plastic baggie, then tucked them into a waterproof pocket of my day pack. They were more than just proof. They were a solemn burden, a reminder of the purpose that now drove me. As darkness fell, a profound sense of isolation settled over me. There was no one to tell, no one who would believe me. I was utterly alone in this. The weight of it was almost unbearable, but the alternative inaction was worse. I checked my watch, 8:30 p.m. I needed to leave at first light. The thought of venturing back into the woods, back towards that place, filled me with a cold dread that made my blood run sluggish. But I had to. I tried to sleep, but it was impossible. Every rustle of leaves outside, every creak of the cabin made me jump. The whispers were constant now, a low, maddening hum in the background of my thoughts. I spent the night staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the horrors, preparing myself for the inevitable return. The first hint of dawn, a faint gray light in the eastern sky, found me already awake, dressed, and with my pack by the door. I grabbed a last mug of coffee, cold now, and gulped it down. I pulled on my boots, tightened the laces, and shouldered my pack. The rifle felt heavy and cold in my hands. As I stepped out of the cabin, the cool morning air hit my face, crisp and refreshing. The woods were silent, serene, oblivious to the monstrous secret they held. The familiar scent of pine and damp earth filled my lungs. For a moment, a fleeting second, I almost turned back, almost convinced myself it had all been a nightmare. But then I felt the weight of the camera on my chest, heard the faint whisper in my mind, and saw the dog tags tucked into my pack's pocket. It was real, and I had to face it. I left a note on my kitchen table just in case. A simple, gone hiking, back soon. It felt like a lie, a betrayal of the truth I was now living, but it was all I could do. I set off into the woods, following the deer trail, retracing my steps from yesterday, but this time with a grim determination. The woods felt different now. The familiar comfort was gone, replaced by a pervasive sense of unease. Every shadow seemed to lengthen, every sound seemed amplified, tinged with menace. I found myself constantly scanning the tree line, expecting to see a shimmer, a distortion, a glimpse of impossible light. I used my GPS to track my progress, double-checking it against my topographical map. I hiked steadily, pushing myself, ignoring the growing ache in my muscles. The sun rose higher, filtering through the trees, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. It was a beautiful day, a stark contrast to the darkness that lay ahead. Around noon, I reached the approximate location I had marked on my map. The woods here were dense, a thick tangle of old growth and underbrush. There was no obvious clearing, no shimmering light, nothing to indicate the terrifying gateway that lay hidden within. I stopped, my heart pounding. I pulled out my compass. As expected, the needle spun wildly, erratically, just as it had in the gray clearing. I was close, too close. I holstered my rifle, keeping it readily accessible, and gripped the camera with one hand, ready to raise it. I began to push through the dense foliage slowly, carefully, my senses on high alert. The air here felt subtly different, heavy, charged with an unseen energy. The scent of pine and earth was still present, but it was overlaid with something else, something metallic like ozone, very faint, but there. I walked for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 20 minutes, pushing through thickets of young hemlocks and birch. Their branches tore at my jacket, scratched my face. I remembered this. This was the exact kind of dense thicket I had pushed through to enter the meadow the first time. And then I saw it, a shimmer, a distortion in the air just beyond the last line of trees. It was like looking through heat haze, a ripple in reality itself. It was almost invisible, a trick of the light, but I knew what it was. The veil, the boundary. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. This was it. There was no turning back. I pushed through the final curtain of branches, emerging into the familiar, yet utterly alien, landscape of the first meadow. My senses were immediately assaulted. The blinding, pervasive glow, that impossibly bright, diffused light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The swirling temperatures, the clashing scents of snow, blooming flowers, wood smoke, and ripening berries. The ground beneath my boots was a chaotic patchwork of winter, spring, summer, and autumn, each season vividly, violently distinct. And in the center, the black monolith, silent, imposing, absorbing all light. My stomach lurched, my head swam. The overwhelming sensory input was just as disorienting as the first time. But this time I was prepared. I knew what to expect. I scanned the meadow, my eyes darting nervously towards the monolith, then across the seasonal divides. The shadow creature. Was it here? Was it waiting? The meadow was still, unnaturally still. The conflicting breezes rustled the various seasonal flora, but there was no sign of the shimmering void, no lurking form. It was gone, banished, or merely hidden. I didn't waste time. I had a mission. I needed to understand. I needed to find the portal to the gray clearing and then to the crystalline one. I had to retrace my steps, observe, document. I remembered the twisted tree, the subtle anomaly that had guided me out of the gray clearing. There had to be an equivalent here, a unique marker, a specific threshold. I began to walk slowly, methodically, circling the perimeter of the meadow, keeping the black monolith in sight. My rifle was slung across my back, ready. The camera was clutched in my hand, its cracked lens ready to flash. My gaze swept the tree line, searching for any irregularity, any sign that wasn't part of the chaotic, shifting facade. The ground continued its jarring dance beneath my feet, crunching snow, then soft earth, then rustling leaves, then damp grass. The light made depth perception difficult, constantly playing tricks on my eyes. After about 15 minutes of careful observation, I saw it. It was subtle, so subtle I almost missed it, a barely perceptible ripple in the fabric of the tree line near the spring section of the meadow. Not a heat haze, but a faint, almost invisible distortion that seemed to twist the light around it. It was like looking at a perfectly flat pane of glass, but knowing there was a tiny, unseen flaw within it. I approached it cautiously, my heart pounding. As I got closer, the distortion became more pronounced, though still incredibly subtle. It didn't look like a physical opening, more like a specific point of transition, a place where the veil was thin. I reached out my hand, slowly, tentatively. As my fingers touched the invisible distortion, a familiar sensation washed over me, a rush of cold, a fading of light, and the insidious, low hum of the whispers. It was the same feeling as pushing through the twisted tree. This was the way. I took a deep breath and stepped through. The world drained of color. The pervasive glow vanished, replaced by the perpetual twilight of the gray clearing. The swirling temperatures ceased, giving way to the intense, gnawing cold. The conflicting scents were replaced by a void, a sterile absence of smell, and the whispers, they were back. Louder now, more insistent, a maddening drone that immediately began to press against my skull, trying to worm its way into my sanity. The black monolith loomed in the center of the clearing, a silent, imposing sentinel, radiating its intense cold and broadcasting its incomprehensible chorus of voices. The skeletal trees, their black branches twisted like grasping claws, stood in silent judgment, their bare limbs reaching towards the dull, featureless sky. I clenched my jaw, fighting against the overwhelming assault. I wouldn't break, not this time. I was here on purpose, with a plan. My next goal, the twisted tree, the exit to the crystalline clearing. I scanned the perimeter of the gray clearing, trying to locate the subtle metallic sheen, the spiraling trunk. It was disorienting. The uniform dull light, the endless identical black trees, it was designed to make you lose your way. The whispers intensified, becoming a cacophony, 1,000 voices screaming ancient, terrible secrets directly into my brain, yet still without discernible words. My head throbbed, a relentless pounding behind my eyes. I felt my grip on reality slipping again, that terrifying sensation of being unmoored. "Focus," I muttered to myself, my voice hoarse. "Remember the pattern." I forced myself to ignore the whispers, to look beyond the uniform bleakness. I started walking in a slow circle, my eyes meticulously scanning each tree. It was tedious, agonizing work, the whispers a constant, maddening companion. My fingers clutched the camera, ready for anything. After what felt like an hour, but was probably only 20 minutes, I found it. The subtle metallic sheen, the faint spiral twist at the base of the trunk. It was precisely where I remembered it, but so easily missed amidst the mental torment. I reached the tree, placing my hand on its cold, hard bark. The faint vibration was still there, a quiet hum that was distinct from the monolith's whispers. It was a resonance that felt anticipatory. I pushed through the twisted branches. They parted easily, unnaturally so, as if welcoming me. And just like before, I stepped through an unseen veil. The oppressive silence of the gray clearing shattered. The constant, maddening whispers ceased instantly, leaving behind a ringing echo in my ears. The cold vanished, replaced by a soft, enveloping warmth. The dull, uniform twilight dissolved into a vibrant golden haze infused with a dizzying array of colors that shifted and pulsed like a slow-motion aurora borealis. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and burnt sugar, sweet and cloying. I was back in the luminous, phosphorescent clearing. The ground was covered in the carpet of glowing moss, casting strange, shifting patterns of green and blue. The trees were tall, graceful, their bark a pearlescent white, their leaves a translucent, iridescent silver that shimmered with every imperceptible breeze. Everything glowed, pulsed, shimmered with an inner light, creating a dizzying, beautiful, and utterly alien landscape. And in the center of this glowing clearing stood the crystalline monolith. It was smaller still, perhaps 20 feet tall, made of an iridescent material that seemed to catch and refract the light, sending dazzling rainbows spiraling through the air. It pulsed with a soft, warm light of its own, a gentle thrumming that was felt more than heard, resonating deep in my chest. A strange sense of calm washed over me, a temporary reprieve from the terror and mental assault. This place, despite its horrifying secret, felt less immediately threatening, more serene. I walked towards the crystalline monolith, my boots sinking slightly into the soft, luminous moss. The symbols on its surface seemed to pulse, to shift, almost as if they were trying to communicate with me. I felt a strange draw, an irresistible curiosity to touch them, to understand their meaning. As I approached the monolith, my gaze fell to its base. The dog tags, Thomas Miller's wallet, they were still there, scattered among the glowing moss, a grim collection of the lost. I remembered the ones I carried in my pack. They were proof of lives consumed by this beautiful, terrible place. I knelt, picking up one of the dog tags, a small, cold disc of metal. Buddy, missing 9/14/2007. I held it, a silent promise forming in my mind. I would find a way to get these back to their families, to give them closure. A naive, desperate hope, perhaps, but a powerful motivator nonetheless. I examined the symbols on the crystalline monolith more closely. They were intricate, flowing, unlike any language or script I had ever seen. They hummed with a quiet power, a resonant meaning that I couldn't quite grasp but felt in my bones. I gently touched one of the glowing symbols. It felt warm, smooth, impossibly ancient. As my finger brushed against it, a faint ripple of light spread across the monolith's surface like water disturbed. The thrumming intensified slightly, resonating deeper in my chest. Nothing else happened. No flashes, no whispers, no immediate portal. Just a gentle, almost benevolent energy. I pulled out the voice recorder from my pack. I switched it on, holding it up, hoping it might capture the subtle hum, the almost silent communication of the monolith, or perhaps, if I was lucky, translate the meaning of the symbols. The small red light on the recorder glowed steadily, indicating it was recording. I stayed there for a long time, recording, observing, trying to absorb every detail of this impossible place. The pearlescent trees seemed to sway gently, their silver leaves shimmering. The luminous moss pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat. The air was warm, sweet, and filled with a profound sense of ancient peace, overlaid with the deep sadness of all the lost souls. My mind, though still reeling from the trauma, was working, trying to find a pattern, a connection. 3 monoliths, 3 distinct clearings. The black monolith of chaos and the shadow creature, the black monolith of despair and whispers, and this crystalline monolith, a beautiful, luminous trap for the lost. What did they represent? Different facets of a single, colossal entity, or separate entities, each with its own purpose. I remembered the different responses each monolith had given me. The first had spawned the shadow creature. The second had shown me terrifying visions of my own demise. This one, so far, seemed inert, peaceful, almost inviting, but I knew its true nature, a graveyard. I needed to find the way out, not just back to the woods, but a definitive end to this nightmare. Was there another portal, a fourth clearing, or was there a way to sever the connection, to close this interdimensional rift? I stood up, my gaze sweeping the perimeter of the luminous clearing. The pearlescent trees formed a seamless, shimmering wall. No obvious distortions, no twisted branches. This was the place of no escape, the final resting place. Yet I had escaped it once. I had pushed through its border by pure desperate chance. I had to find the specific point where I had re-entered the gray clearing. It wouldn't be as obvious as the twisted tree. It would be a subtle transition, a veil that was only apparent if you were looking for it. I began to methodically circle the perimeter of the crystalline clearing, my eyes narrowed, searching for any anomaly in the shimmering wall of trees. The glowing moss softened my footsteps, making my progress eerily silent. The gentle thrum of the monolith followed me, a constant, resonant presence. The sun, or what passed for it here, was a constant, golden haze. There was no sense of time, no progression of day or night. It was a perpetual, beautiful twilight. After nearly an hour of careful searching, I found it. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the air, a slight blurring of the iridescent silver leaves of one particular pearlescent tree. It was so subtle, it was almost indistinguishable from the natural shimmering of the leaves. But I felt it, a cold ripple in the warm air, a momentary fading of the sweet ozone scent. It was the same sensation as when I had left the crystalline clearing the first time. This was the way back to the gray clearing, and then to the terrifying first meadow, and hopefully, finally, to the exit to my own world. I took a deep breath, the sweet air filling my lungs. I paused for a moment, looking back at the crystalline monolith, at the scattered dog tags. "I'll be back," I whispered, a promise to the lost. "I'll find a way." I pushed through the shimmering leaves, bracing myself for the cold, the darkness, and the whispers. The transition was instant and brutal. The warmth vanished, replaced by a bone-chilling cold. The light faded to a dull, oppressive twilight. The sweet scent was ripped away, leaving a sterile void, and the whispers, they crashed over me like a tidal wave, a cacophony of ancient, malevolent voices screaming directly into my skull. I stumbled, clutching my head, trying to fight off the immediate assault. The black monolith loomed in the distance, radiating its intense cold and despair. The skeletal trees stood like silent, tormenting judges. This time, however, I had a plan. I wasn't going to walk towards the monolith. I knew the way out. I knew where the twisted tree was. I immediately turned, orienting myself towards the direction I remembered the twisted tree to be. The whispers were a constant, maddening roar in my head, making it difficult to think, to focus. But I pushed through, my resolve hardened. I walked quickly, my eyes scanning the endless, identical black trees, searching for the subtle metallic sheen, the spiraling trunk. The gray dust puffed around my boots, settling on my clothes, coating my skin. The cold seeped into my bones, trying to freeze my determination. "Not this time," I muttered, my voice barely audible above the din in my head. "You won't break me." I found the twisted tree more quickly this time, my focused gaze cutting through the disorienting bleakness. I put my hand on its bark, feeling the familiar, anticipatory hum beneath my palm. I pushed through the branches, stepping through the invisible veil. The oppressive silence of the gray clearing shattered. The constant, maddening whispers ceased instantly, leaving behind a ringing echo in my ears. The cold vanished, replaced by a chaotic swirl of temperatures. The dull, uniform twilight dissolved into a dizzying kaleidoscope of shifting, swirling light. I was back in the first meadow, the impossible multi-seasonal one. My senses were immediately assaulted. The biting cold of winter on one side, the gentle warmth of spring on the other. The rich, humid scent of wildflowers mingling with the crisp smell of snow, the decaying autumn leaves, the ripe summer berries. The air was a maelstrom of conflicting temperatures and aromas. I scanned the meadow, my heart pounding. The black monolith stood silently in the center, an imposing, dark pillar against the dazzling, shifting landscape. The seasonal divisions were stark, violent, each a distinct quarter of the circle. And the shadow creature, my eyes darted to the winter section, then to the spring. Nothing, no shimmering void, no lurking form. The creature was still banished or hidden. The relief was immense, allowing me to focus. My mission here was clear: find the exit, the specific thicket of young hemlocks and birch that led back to my own world. I remembered its appearance, the way the light had seemed to soften around it. I began to circle the perimeter again, but with a different purpose. I wasn't just searching for a random break in the trees, I was searching for the break, the one I had stumbled through yesterday. The light of the meadow, that pervasive, brilliant glow, made it difficult. The trees that ringed the clearing seemed to stretch into an infinite, shifting wall, constantly changing with the seasons, but I had to find it. I walked slowly, methodically, my eyes sweeping the tree line. The ground continued its jarring dance beneath my feet, snow to earth to leaves to grass. The constant sensory assault was disorienting, but I pushed through it. As I walked past the summer section, a faint shimmer caught my eye. It was at the very edge of the tree line, a slight distortion in the air, a place where the light seemed to dim almost imperceptibly, where the trees felt less alive, less imposing than the rest of the shimmering, shifting wall. It was the same kind of subtle ripple I had seen when I first entered. This was it, the way out. My heart hammered against my ribs, a mixture of terror and exhilaration. I was so close. I moved towards the distortion, my steps cautious. The air grew cooler, the overwhelming sense of the meadow began to recede, replaced by the more familiar but still faint smell of pine and damp earth. The pervasive glow of the meadow dimmed slightly, allowing a hint of dappled sunlight to filter through. I reached the edge of the tree line, my hand outstretched. My fingers brushed against the invisible veil. It was cool, almost imperceptible. I could feel the familiar air of my own woods, hear the faint rustle of real leaves. I took a deep breath and stepped through. The world stabilized instantly. The clashing seasons vanished, replaced by the uniform coolness of late autumn. The blinding light dissolved into the soft, golden light of late afternoon, filtered through the turning leaves, casting long, familiar shadows. I was back, truly back. The crisp, cool air of late autumn, carrying the familiar scent of pine needles and damp earth, filled my lungs. The ground beneath my boots was solid, consistent, covered in a reassuring carpet of pine needles and fallen leaves. No swirling temperatures, no clashing scents, no dizzying light, just the familiar, comforting reality of the Adirondack wilderness. I stumbled forward a few steps, then collapsed to my knees, my legs giving out beneath me. The relief was immense, a wave so powerful it threatened to buckle my sanity. I buried my face in my hands, gasping for air that felt clean, real, breathable. My body trembled uncontrollably, not from fear this time, but from the sheer exhaustion, the mental and physical strain of what I had just endured. Tears, hot and uncontrollable, streamed down my face, mingling with the dirt and sweat on my skin. I had done it. I had gone back and I had come out again. I forced myself to look back at the spot where I had emerged. The trees were dense, impenetrable, a seamless wall of familiar green and gold. No sign of the meadow, no impossible light, no hint of the horrors I had just experienced. Just woods, my woods. My entire body was shaking, my mind still reeling from the impossible journey. I touched my face, my hands, feeling the rough texture of my skin, the ache in my muscles, the cold autumn air on my cheeks. It was real. I was here. But the memory of it all was seared into my brain. The multi-seasonal meadow, the silent shadow, the gray clearing with its whispering monolith, the luminous, beautiful graveyard of the lost. The dog tag still clutched in my hand, Thomas Miller's wallet in my pack, the cracked camera around my neck, tangible proof that it hadn't been a dream, a hallucination. My journal, filled with my frantic scribblings, was tucked safely in my pack, and the voice recorder. I pulled it out, its small red light still glowing, indicating it had been recording throughout my entire journey. A faint, almost imperceptible hum emanated from it. I quickly switched it off, not wanting to hear the echoes of that place just yet. My phone, I pulled it from my day pack. The screen flickered to life, showing the time, 4:17 p.m. Less than 3 hours had passed since I had re-entered the portal. It felt like a lifetime. The GPS was strong, clear, showing my tiny, blinking dot firmly on a detailed topological map, precisely where I had emerged yesterday, about 10 miles from my cabin. My lifeline reconnected. I had to get back, had to get home, my sanctuary. I stood up, my legs still wobbly, my body bruised and aching, my mind a chaotic mess of trauma and disbelief. But I was alive, I was back, and I had learned. I started walking, not running this time, but with a renewed sense of purpose, a desperate need for the familiar. I followed the deer trail, the one that had led me into this nightmare, but now it felt like a path to salvation. I was acutely aware of every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, every distant bird call. The woods that had once been my peace now held a deep, lingering terror, but it was a terror I had faced and for now overcome. I didn't look back, I didn't dare. I just kept walking, one foot in front of the other, putting distance between myself and that God-forsaken place. My cabin was 10 miles away, a long walk even on a good day, and the sun was already dipping towards the horizon. I would be walking in the dark again. But I would make it, I had to. This time there was more than just fear driving me, there was a grim determination, a burning need for understanding. As I walked, the events of the last few hours replayed in my mind, a terrifying loop of impossible realities, but this time with a sense of clarity. I had mapped the portals, I understood the transitions, I had seen the true nature of each clearing, and I had confirmed the camera's power. It was my key, my weapon. The sun dipped below the tree line, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples. The woods grew darker, the shadows longer, more indistinct. The sounds of the forest changed, the daytime chirps replaced by the calls of unseen nocturnal creatures. Every rustle, every creak of a branch made me jump, but the sheer panic of yesterday was replaced by a wary alertness. I was not helpless anymore. I kept walking, guided by the dim light of twilight, then by the pale glow of the rising moon. The exhaustion was setting in, deep and bone-wearing, but I couldn't stop. I had to reach the cabin, had to be enclosed by solid walls, by something familiar, something real. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably a few hours, I saw the faint, comforting glow of my cabin light through the trees. It was a beacon, a promise of safety, of normalcy. I pushed through the last stretch of woods, breaking out into my small clearing, stumbling towards the familiar porch. I fumbled with the key, my hands shaking so badly I could barely insert it into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing the warm, inviting interior of my home. I stepped inside, slamming the door shut and locking it with a final, desperate click. I leaned against the door, gasping for breath, my eyes scanning the familiar room, the worn armchair, the cluttered desk with my computer, the wood-burning stove. It was all there, untouched, real. I sank to the floor, my backpack sliding off my shoulders, spilling nothing this time. I had meticulously packed everything away. The cracked camera still hung around my neck. I was home, I was safe, for now. But as I sat there, curled against the door, the scent of pine and coffee mixed with the phantom smell of snow and blooming flowers, of wood smoke and ozone. And in the oppressive quiet of my cabin, I could still hear it, a faint, sibilant echo in the deep recesses of my mind, the whisper of the gray monolith. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. I managed to push myself up, my muscles screaming in protest. I needed food, warmth, and most importantly, rest. But sleep felt like a distant, impossible luxury. The whispers, though faint, were enough to keep my mind racing, replaying the terrifying logic of those impossible places. I stumbled to the kitchen, poured myself a large glass of water, and then another shot of whiskey. The burn was familiar now, a temporary shield against the gnawing dread. I forced myself to eat a high-energy bar from my pack, though my stomach churned. I relit the fire in the wood-burning stove, the crackle and warmth a physical comfort. Then, without even bothering to change out of my sweat-soaked clothes, I sat down at my desk. My journal lay open from yesterday's frantic documentation. I uncapped my pen, my hand still trembling, and began to add the new information. I wrote about the precise locations of the portals, the subtle shimmer in the tree line of the meadow near the spring section for the gray clearing, the twisted tree in the gray clearing for the crystalline one, and the faint blur in the crystalline clearing's shimmering trees for the gray clearing. And finally, the distinct dimming of light in the meadows trees near the summer section for the exit back to my world. I sketched rough maps, noting landmarks, however bizarre they were. This was crucial. This was the map out of hell. I also documented the camera's performance. It had powered on with a new battery, and its lens, despite the cracks, still allowed it to function. I had not needed to use it this time, which was a relief, but it was still my ace in the hole. I pulled out the voice recorder and the dog tags. I listened to the recording. At first, it was just the rustle of my clothes, my heavy breathing, the sounds of the Adirondack woods. Then the distinct, jarring shift, the cacophony of the meadow, the clashing breezes, the chaotic mix of seasonal sounds, the overwhelming sense, somehow faintly discernible even on a recording. Then the terrifying, almost subliminal hum of the whispers from the gray clearing, a low, incessant drone that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. Then the beautiful, resonant thrum of the crystalline monolith overlaid with a strange, almost musical, silent communication. The recording captured the essence of each place, the sheer wrongness of it all. It was chilling, undeniable proof. I put the recorder away, feeling a new weight settle upon me. I had documentation. I had proof. But what was I supposed to do with it? Who would believe me? And more importantly, how could I stop it? The dog tags, Thomas Miller's wallet, and Emily's charm lay on the table, each a life, a story. I picked up one of the crystalline tags, Shadow, missing 4/22/2012. Another pet, another family lost to this place. My promise to them, to their owners, echoed in my mind. I couldn't just keep going back and forth, playing interdimensional tourist. There had to be a way to close these portals, to dismantle the monoliths, to free the lost souls. But how? What were they? Why were they there? My grandmother's stories came back to me again. Ancient evils, she'd called them, placeholders for things that shouldn't be. She'd spoken of warding, of protective symbols, of finding the key to unlock or seal such places. I remembered her intricate carvings on various objects around her house, patterns she claimed kept bad things away. Superstitious nonsense, I had always thought. Now I wasn't so sure. I spent the next few days in a daze, a prisoner in my own cabin. I couldn't bring myself to venture outside for more than brief trips to gather firewood. The woods, once my solace, now felt like a lurking threat. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret, every rustle of leaves a potential portal opening. The whispers, though faint in the cabin, were a constant background hum in my mind, a chilling reminder that the impossible was just beyond my doorstep. I ate sparingly, slept fitfully, haunted by nightmares of shifting landscapes and silent shadows. I pored over my journal, over old maps, over my grandmother's forgotten books, searching for any clue, any piece of information that could shed light on the monoliths, on the clearings, on the nature of this impossible reality. I found nothing conclusive. The old texts spoke of thin places, of fey paths, of dream gates, but always in vague, allegorical terms. There was no practical guide to dismantling interdimensional portals. My frustration mounted. I had gained knowledge, yes, but no answers. I was still stuck, still reeling, still utterly alone. The whispers intensified with each passing day, subtly at first, then more insistently. They were never loud enough to be words, but they were a constant, maddening pressure, a chorus of unseen voices trying to penetrate my defenses. My head ached perpetually. I felt my sanity fraying at the edges. I knew I couldn't stay like this. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary, it was a cage. I realized with a chilling certainty that the longer I stayed near the portals, the stronger their influence became. The whispers weren't just a memory, they were an active, insidious assault. It was trying to break me, to draw me back in, to make me another lost soul. I needed to understand the monoliths. I needed to interact with them, not just touch them, but to truly understand their purpose. And I needed to do it without losing myself to them. I pulled out my topographic map. My cabin was 10 miles from the portal. What if the influence weakened with distance? It was a desperate theory, but worth exploring. I needed a new perspective, a place far enough away to clear my head, but still close enough to be able to return when needed. The nearest town, Solitude, was about 30 miles from my cabin. It was small, isolated, and barely had a population of 500. But it had a small library, a general store, and crucially a connection to the outside world. It would be a temporary refuge, a place to gather my thoughts, to plan my next move without the constant pressure of the whispers. It was a risk. Leaving the cabin meant leaving my only real refuge, my only direct connection to the known world. But staying was a slower, more insidious form of destruction. I packed a small bag, fresh clothes, my wallet, my phone, the journal, the camera, the voice recorder, and the dog tags. The rifle I left behind. I couldn't walk into a small town with a hunting rifle, and I knew it was useless against the real enemy anyway. I loaded my pack into my old pickup truck, a battered but reliable Ford Ranger. The drive into town was usually a pleasant, familiar journey. This time, it felt like an escape. Every mile that put distance between me and the portal felt like a small victory. As I drove, the whispers in my mind slowly, gradually began to recede. By the time I reached solitude, they were almost imperceptible, a faint, nagging ghost rather than an active torment. The relief was palpable, like shedding a heavy cloak. Solitude was just as I remembered it. A single main street, a few weathered buildings surrounded by the endless green and gold of the Adirondacks. I parked my truck outside the general store, its familiar facade a welcome sight. I went inside, the bell above the door jingling. Mrs. Henderson, the owner, a stout woman with kind eyes and a perpetually flour-dusted apron, looked up from behind the counter. "Well, look who it is. Haven't seen you in a while, John. Everything all right out there in the wilderness?" I managed a weak smile. "Just fine, Mrs. Henderson. Been busy, you know." "I thought you might be. You look a bit peaked, like you've seen a ghost." She chuckled. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "Something like that," I mumbled. I bought some groceries, some fresh clothes, and a new, more powerful flashlight. Then I inquired about rooms. There was a small, dusty motel on the edge of town, the Solitude Inn, that rented rooms by the week. It wasn't fancy, but it was a bed, hot water, and solid walls, far enough from the whispers to provide genuine respite. I checked into the inn, dropping my bags in the sparsely furnished room. The silence here was different from the cabins. It was a true silence without the underlying hum of the whispers. It was a profound, almost dizzying relief. I took a long, hot shower, scrubbing away the grime and sweat of the past few days. It felt like washing away a layer of the nightmare. I changed into clean clothes, the simple act of normalcy, a small victory. I spent the next few days in the small town, trying to blend in, trying to be normal. I visited the library, a small but well-stocked building run by an elderly woman named Martha who had known my grandmother. I spent hours poring over local history books, old newspaper clippings, and folklore collections. I was searching for anything, any hint, any legend that might connect to the impossible clearings. Martha, a quiet woman with a keen intellect, noticed my intense focus. "Researching something particular, John?" she asked one afternoon, her voice soft. "Something unusual," I admitted, looking up from an old book on local geology. "Legends of the deep woods." She smiled faintly. "Ah, the old stories. My grandmother used to tell me tales. She said the Adirondacks were alive not just with creatures, but with spirits, with ancient magic. Places that would reveal themselves only to those who truly sought them or those who were truly lost." Her words echoed my grandmother's. "Did she ever mention places that defy logic?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. places where seasons clash or time bends or where things just vanish. Martha's eyes, usually sparkling with gentle humor, grew distant, thoughtful. She spoke of a place, the heart of the woods, she called it, a nexus. A place where the world breathed, where all things came together and sometimes came apart. She said it was guarded by shadows, by whispers, by the lost. My heart pounded. This was it. This was what I had been searching for. Guarded how? She never said precisely, just that the guardians were a test. To reach the heart, you had to face them, endure them, and that the heart itself held immense power, power to create and to unmake. Martha closed the book she was holding, her gaze returning to me, intense and knowing. Why are you asking, John? Have you encountered something? I hesitated. How much could I tell her? She was a kind, intelligent woman, but this was beyond belief. I think I've seen a place like that, I admitted, my voice low. It was indescribable. Martha nodded slowly, not with disbelief, but with a profound sadness. My grandmother always warned against seeking such places, said they weren't for mortals, that they would consume you body and soul if you weren't careful. But she also said, if one were to truly understand the heart, one could perhaps influence it, turn its power. Influence it, I pressed, my mind racing. How? She said the heart was like a living thing. It responded to intent, to will, and that to truly influence it, one needed a focal point, something to channel your will, your purpose. She looked at the old book in my hands. Do you believe in magic, John? I thought of the camera, of its impossible flash, of the shadow creature's shriek. I believe in things I can't explain, I said. Martha smiled again, a wistful, knowing smile. Then perhaps you are exactly where you need to be. My grandmother left behind some journals. They're not here, they're at her old cabin about 20 miles south of yours. I've never read them myself. Too many strange ramblings, but perhaps for you. A surge of hope, sharp and exhilarating, shot through me. Her journals, would you let me see them? They're yours if you want them. She always said if anyone ever came looking for the heart, they should have access to her notes. She knew, she always knew. Martha wrote down an address and a brief set of directions on a slip of paper. It's a bit overgrown, but the cabin's still there. Just be careful, John. Some things are best left undisturbed. I thanked her profusely, my heart pounding with a renewed sense of purpose. My grandmother's journals, she might have had answers. She might have known the key. I left the library that afternoon with a lighter step, the whispers now completely silent in my mind. The distance and the hope of new information had given me a much-needed respite. The next morning, I drove out to my grandmother's old cabin. It was indeed overgrown, nestled deep in a forgotten corner of the woods, far from any paved road. The small, weathered structure had clearly been abandoned for decades, but it still stood, a testament to her quiet resilience. The air inside was stale, musty, thick with the scent of old wood and forgotten memories. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the grimy windows. The furniture was draped in white sheets, ghostly figures in the dim light, but what I was looking for wasn't hidden. On a small, heavy oak desk in what had been her study lay a stack of leather-bound journals. They were old, brittle, their covers faded but meticulously kept. I recognized the same distinctive handwriting from the note on my own kitchen table, the one she'd left me after she passed. I sat down in her creaky wooden chair, a sense of reverence settling over me. This was her legacy, her secrets, and perhaps my salvation. I opened the first journal. The pages were filled with observations, strange drawings, notes on local plants and animals, and then slowly, gradually, tales of things that defied explanation. She spoke of energies, of ley lines, of places where reality thinned. She had indeed encountered the heart of the woods. She had explored its periphery cautiously, respectfully, for years. Her entries detailed her first encounters, strange light phenomena, disorienting shifts in temperature, peculiar animal behavior. She spoke of feeling watched, of whispers that tried to confuse and mislead. She had, like me, stumbled upon the gray clearing, though she called it the place of forgotten truths, and she spoke of its monolith as the speaker of silence. She had heard its whispers, had felt its cold despair, but she had never dared to touch it, never succumbed to its torment. She described a third place, one of luminous beauty and profound sorrow, which she called the graveyard of echoes. She had seen the lost souls, the lingering imprints of those consumed by the place. She had intuited the nature of the crystalline monolith, calling it the collector of souls. But she never mentioned the dog tags, implying she never ventured close enough to see them. Her description of the shadow guardian was chillingly accurate. She called it the hunter of the unwary, a manifestation of the heart's defensive mechanisms designed to repel or consume anything that trespassed too deeply. She had never directly confronted it, but had witnessed its terrifying swiftness, its impossible stillness. And then I found an entry dated years ago that made my blood run cold. She spoke of a rare mineral found only in the deepest veins of the earth, one that had unique resonant properties. She believed it could capture and amplify certain energies, and that if properly focused, it could act as a ward against the unseen, a light against shadow. She had managed to acquire a small piece of this mineral, described its appearance as lustrous, almost pearlescent, with a faint internal glow. She had tried to incorporate it into various devices, hoping to create a protective tool. Most failed, but one she noted, a small optical device, showed unexpected promise. It seems to absorb ambient light and release it in a focused burst when activated, she wrote. A flash of pure light, a potential deterrent. My camera, my ordinary digital camera, given to me by her years ago, it wasn't ordinary at all. She must have secretly embedded a piece of that mineral, that pearlescent amplifier, into its lens or some component near it. She had subtly engineered my camera into a warding device, a weapon against the very things she feared I might encounter, a bittersweet, terrifying realization. She had prepared me even after her death. I continued reading, frantically turning pages. She theorized that the three clearings and their associated monoliths were not separate entities, but rather different aspects or nodes of a single, colossal interdimensional engine. The heart of the woods was precisely that, a living, breathing mechanism that absorbed energy from different realities, weaving them into a chaotic, unstable nexus. The black monolith in the meadow was the anchor holding the chaos in place. The whispering monolith was the drain, siphoning despair and fear. The crystalline one was the accumulator, storing the essences of the lost. Her most crucial insight, however, was about the purpose of the monoliths. She believed they were not inherently malicious, but simply functioning. They were part of a system, an alien mechanism that was, perhaps, simply operating as designed, and to stop them one couldn't simply destroy them. You cannot destroy the breath of the world, she wrote. You must redirect it, repurpose it, return it to its rightful place. Return it to its rightful place. What did that mean? Her final entries grew more frantic, more desperate. She believed the heart was destabilizing, growing, encroaching upon our reality. She spoke of a central core, a fulcrum point that connected all three monoliths, a fourth location, unseen and unknown, where the true power of the heart resided. To truly influence the heart, one had to reach this central core. She never found it. Her notes ended abruptly, a half-finished sentence about a peculiar alignment of stars and a subtle shift in the local magnetic field. She had been searching for the core when she passed. I closed the journal, my mind reeling. My grandmother, the eccentric old woman I had always dismissed as superstitious, was a pioneer, an explorer of impossible realities. She had not only understood this place, but she had also given me the means to fight back. I had a weapon, a map of the portals, a detailed understanding of the clearings, and now a crucial theory about the heart of the woods and its central core. This was more than I could have ever hoped for. But the central core, where was it? How would I find it? And what did returning its power to its rightful place truly entail? I drove back to Solitude, my head buzzing with new information, new questions. The whispers were completely absent now, a testament to the distance and the absorbing nature of my research. But the weight of my task, of this immense responsibility, had grown. I spent another night at the Solitude Inn trying to consolidate my thoughts. The answer to where the central core was had to be in the heart itself. The three clearings formed a triangle or perhaps a cross, with the multi-seasonal meadow at the center of the first layer of transition. Each monolith was a node. The central core had to be the true nexus, the true center of the entire structure. I needed a way to perceive that central core, something that could cut through the illusions, the chaotic energies. My grandmother's notes mentioned the peculiar alignment of stars. Could this be an astronomical key? Was the central core only accessible at certain times or under certain celestial conditions? I pulled out my phone and looked up star charts for the Adirondacks. I cross-referenced it with historical astronomical events, trying to see if there were any unusual alignments around the dates of known disappearances or around the time my grandmother's last journal entries hinted at. It was a long shot, a needle in a haystack, but I had to try. I spent the entire next day at the library again, looking up old almanacs, astronomical charts, and local weather patterns. Martha helped me, sensing my renewed urgency, though I didn't reveal the full extent of my findings. There was a meteor shower a few weeks ago, Martha mentioned, pointing to an old newspaper clipping. Quite spectacular, they said, the Perseids very bright. A meteor shower, celestial activity, my grandmother's peculiar alignment of stars. Could it be related? I checked my current date. The Perseid meteor shower had been active just a few weeks prior, and the date of Thomas Miller's disappearance, August 11, 2003. The Perseids peak around August 12-13, a strong correlation. What about the other disappearances? I looked up the dates on the dog tags. Daisy 901-2005, Buddy 914-2007, Rex 1005-2009, Mittens 11-2010. Shadow 422-2012, Emily 603-2014. The dates were scattered across the year. No clear pattern with known major meteor showers. But meteor showers weren't the only celestial events. There were solstices, equinoxes, lunar phases, planetary alignments. It was too complex, too much information. Perhaps, Martha suggested, it's not about what's in the sky, but what's on the ground that reflects the sky. She tapped an old book open. Ancient cultures believed that sacred places were often built to align with celestial events, that the ground itself became a mirror for the heavens at certain times. A mirror for the heavens, the glowing moss in the crystalline clearing, the shimmer of the meadow, the reflective surface of the monoliths. What if the central core was only visible or accessible when a certain celestial body was directly overhead one of the monoliths or the nexus point of the clearings? This felt more plausible, a specific, localized reflection. I thought about the structure of the clearings. The multi-seasonal meadow, the gray clearing, the crystalline clearing. They were connected by portals, forming a network. If the meadow was the anchor and the gray and crystalline clearings were its nodes, then the central core had to be in the true center, the heart of that structure. But the clearings themselves were vast. How would I pinpoint a single spot? I remembered my GPS. It worked in my world. But what about in the clearings? It showed a strong satellite signal when I was outside. Did the clearings block GPS signals or just distort them? When I had been in the gray clearing and the crystalline clearing, my compass had spun wildly. That indicated a strong localized magnetic anomaly or some interference. But I hadn't checked my GPS in those places, only when I was back in the real woods. What if GPS did work in the clearings but was simply distorted? What if it showed me a false location, but one that was still consistently incorrect relative to a true center? It was a thought, a risky, perhaps insane thought, but I was running out of rational options. I needed to go back again, but this time with a very specific, dangerous goal. I wasn't just observing, I was hunting for the heart. And I would use the tools of my world, my GPS, my camera, my knowledge, to navigate the impossible. I left solitude that evening, the whispers still blissfully absent. But as I approached my cabin, they began to return, a faint, distant hum that grew subtly stronger with every mile. I felt the familiar weight of dread, but also a fierce resolve. I parked my truck, stepped into the cabin, and immediately retrieved my map. I overlaid the known locations of the 3 clearings as estimated from my GPS exit points. I tried to mentally triangulate a central point. It was an abstract exercise, given the non-Euclidean geometry of the place, but it was a starting point. The central core, according to my grandmother, was the fulcrum, the point of true power. To return its power to its rightful place, I had to understand what that power was and what its rightful place actually meant. I thought of the shadow creature. My camera had banished it. The pearlescent amplifier my grandmother had built into it, capable of creating a focused burst of pure light. Was light the counterforce to the shadow? Was it the key to the core? And the lost souls, the crystalline monolith was the accumulator, storing their essences. Perhaps returning its power meant releasing those souls, allowing them to finally find peace. But how? I realized I needed to study the monoliths more closely, not just to touch them, but to truly understand their function. I needed to interact with them, perhaps even attempt to photograph them with the camera to see if the pearlescent amplifier had any effect beyond simply warding off the shadow creature. The idea of deliberately interacting with the monoliths, especially the whispering one, filled me with a primal dread. But if my grandmother's theory was correct, they were merely cogs in a larger machine. To turn off the machine, I had to understand its cogs. I spent another fitful night, my mind a storm of theories and fears. The whispers in my cabin were now a low, constant hum, a maddening pressure that made sleep impossible. I was running out of time. The longer I stayed, the more I risked losing myself. At dawn, I geared up again. This time I took extra batteries for everything, more food, a thicker jacket. I even added a small, portable mirror to my pack. My grandmother's notes had occasionally hinted at reflections being important in liminal spaces, as if they could reveal things hidden to the naked eye. It was a long shot, but I was grasping at everything. I shouldered my pack, the rifle feeling heavy and strangely comforting on my back. The camera hung around my neck, my impossible weapon. I stepped out of the cabin, the cool morning air a bracing shock. The whispers outside were louder now, a sibilant drone that seemed to emanate from the very trees themselves. But I ignored them, focusing on the mission. I set off into the woods, following the deer trail, retracing my steps to the portal. This time there was no hesitation, only grim resolve. I hiked quickly, pushing myself, ignoring the growing ache in my muscles. Around mid-morning, I reached the shimmering distortion in the tree line. The air here was thick with the conflicting scents of the meadow even before I stepped through. The whispers were a constant roar, trying to turn me back, trying to draw me into madness, but I pushed through them. I stepped through the veil. The world dissolved into the chaotic, dazzling assault of the multi-seasonal meadow. The blinding, pervasive glow, the swirling temperatures, the clashing scents. The ground beneath my boots was a jarring patchwork of winter, spring, summer, and autumn. And in the center, the black monolith, silent, imposing, absorbing all light. I scanned the meadow, no shadow creature. Good. My first task, navigate to the gray clearing. I moved purposefully towards the subtle ripple in the tree line near the spring section. The transition was instant and brutal. Cold, darkness, and the overwhelming, maddening roar of the whispers. The black monolith of the gray clearing loomed in the distance, a silent, tormenting sentinel. The skeletal trees. My eyes scanned the gray clearing, the skeletal trees standing like silent, tormenting judges. The whispers were a constant, suffocating pressure, clawing at my mind, but I fought them back with a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about understanding, about fulfilling my grandmother's legacy. I started walking not towards the monolith, but in a wide arc around it, heading for the twisted tree that marked the entrance to the crystalline clearing. I needed to move quickly to minimize my exposure to this place of despair. My heart hammered against my ribs, a mixture of fear and adrenaline. The gray dust puffed around my boots with every step. The cold seeped into my bones, a gnawing ache that tried to mirror the emptiness the whispers were trying to instill in my soul. But I pushed through it, my gaze fixed on the endless, identical black trees, searching for the subtle metallic sheen. I found it, the twisted tree, more quickly than before. Its familiar metallic sheen and spiraling trunk were a beacon in the oppressive gloom. I placed my hand on its cold bark, feeling the faint, anticipatory hum. Without hesitation, I pushed through its branches. The transition was instant and transformative. The cold, the darkness, and the whispers vanished as if they had never been. The air grew warm and sweet, thick with the scent of ozone and burnt sugar. The dull twilight exploded into a vibrant, golden haze infused with shifting, pulsing colors. I was back in the luminous, phosphorescent clearing. The glowing moss softened my footsteps, casting strange, shifting patterns of green and blue. The pearlescent trees shimmered with iridescent silver leaves radiating an inner light, and in the center, the crystalline monolith pulsed with a soft, warm glow, its gentle thrum resonating deep in my chest. A profound sense of calm washed over me, a brief, welcome reprieve. This place, for all its deceptive beauty and tragic purpose, felt less immediately hostile than the gray clearing. It was still a trap, a graveyard, but a serene one. I walked towards the crystalline monolith, my boots sinking slightly into the soft, glowing moss. I focused on its surface, on the intricate, flowing symbols that pulsed with a quiet power. My grandmother had called it the accumulator, storing the essences of the lost. My previous theory about returning its power meant releasing those souls. This monolith was my starting point. I pulled out my camera, the one my grandmother had subtly engineered. The small digital device, my pearlescent amplifier, now felt like a sacred object. Its cracked lens seemed to wink in the shifting light. I switched it on, confirming the battery was full. I knelt before the monolith, the scattered dog tags still visible among the glowing moss at its base. Buddy, missing 9/14/2007. Shadow, missing 4/22/2012. Each name a silent testament to the monolith's grim purpose. Taking a deep breath, I raised the camera. I wanted to see if its amplified light had any effect on this monolith, if it could interact with the stored essences or the symbols. It was a terrifying thought, but I had to try. I aimed the camera at the monolith, centering one of the largest, most vibrant symbols in its viewfinder. My finger trembled as I pressed the shutter button. The flash was not a normal camera flash. It was a silent, intense burst of pure, pearlescent light, far brighter than anything a standard camera could produce. It radiated outwards from the lens, engulfing the section of the monolith I was focused on. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the monolith thrummed harder, a deep, resonant vibration that I felt in my bones. The symbols I had photographed glowed with an unnerving intensity, pulsing with an inner light that was almost painful to behold. And then it happened. From the surface of the monolith, from the very symbols I had targeted, a faint, almost invisible mist began to emanate. It wasn't smoke, but something ethereal, shimmering with faint, iridescent hues. It rose upwards, swirling gently, coalescing into translucent, humanoid shapes. They were indistinct, shimmering figures, barely visible against the golden haze of the clearing. They were not solid, not fully corporeal, but their forms were unmistakable. Men, women, children, even faint outlines of animals. Dozens, hundreds of them emerging from the monolith, their features undefined, yet imbued with a profound sense of peace. They didn't speak, didn't move towards me. They simply drifted upwards like silent specters ascending to some unseen heaven. Their forms were faint, almost dreamlike, but the feeling they radiated was unmistakable. Release. A quiet, gentle, profound release. The monolith's thrumming softened as the mist continued to rise. The symbols, while still glowing, seemed to dim slightly. The sense of accumulated sorrow, of heavy loss that had permeated the clearing began to dissipate, replaced by a feeling of profound, yet gentle emptiness. The trap, it seemed, was releasing its hold. I watched, awestruck and humbled, as the last of the ethereal figures dissolved into the golden light above. The clearing felt different now. The thrum of the monolith was softer, almost a lullaby. The air, though still sweet, no longer carried the same heavy weight of sorrow. My grandmother's theory was right. The camera was a tool, a weapon, but also a key, and returning its power to its rightful place meant setting these lost souls free. I had released them, but what now? The monolith was still there, still functioning, albeit perhaps in a different capacity. The heart of the woods was still beating. I picked up Thomas Miller's dog tags. The names on them were still legible, but the weight of the metal felt lighter somehow, a subtle shift. I looked around the clearing, a new resolve hardening in my chest. If the camera could release the essences, perhaps it could affect the other monoliths too. Perhaps it could disrupt their functions, not destroy them, but redirect their energies. My grandmother had described this monolith as the accumulator. If I had drained it, or at least released what it accumulated, what about the drain, the whispering monolith in the gray clearing, and the anchor, the black monolith in the meadow? I pulled out my compass. It had been useless in the gray clearing, spinning wildly. But here, in the luminous clearing, it merely spun lazily, as if confused by the ambient energy, but not entirely broken. It still wasn't helpful for navigation within the clearings, but it was a data point. I checked my GPS. To my surprise, it showed a faint, blinking dot, a location. It was wildly inaccurate, showing me somewhere miles off course, but it was a consistent inaccuracy. It was showing a distorted location relative to my real-world position, not just a blank screen. This meant there was a signal, however warped. I snapped a picture of the GPS screen, noting the coordinates displayed, however false. I would need to compare this with readings from the other clearings to triangulate a true center, a true null point where the distortion might be minimal or where the false coordinates converged. This could be the central core. I stood up, the ground feeling solid beneath my feet despite the glowing moss. I had a new task, a new direction. My gaze swept the perimeter of the crystalline clearing, searching for the faint tremor in the air, the subtle blurring of the iridescent leaves that marked the path back to the gray clearing. I found it quickly, my senses now attuned to these subtle shifts. I took a deep breath, the sweet air filling my lungs. I looked back at the monolith, now gleaming gently, no longer laden with sorrow. "I'll be back," I whispered, a promise not of rescue, but of completion. I pushed through the shimmering leaves, bracing myself for the brutal shift. The cold was immediate, a bone-chilling embrace that stole my breath. The light dissolved into a dull, oppressive twilight. The sweet scent was ripped away, leaving a sterile void, and the whispers, they crashed over me, a deafening cacophony of ancient, malevolent voices screaming directly into my skull, trying to tear my sanity to shreds. I stumbled, clutching my head, fighting to remain upright. The black monolith of the gray clearing loomed in the distance, a silent, tormenting sentinel, radiating its intense cold and broadcasting its incomprehensible chorus of voices. The skeletal trees, their black branches twisted like grasping claws, stood in silent judgment. This was the drain, the speaker of silence, the place of forgotten truths. This was where the heart siphoned despair and fear. This was where the whispers were born. I gritted my teeth, ignoring the pounding in my head, the gnawing cold. I had a weapon. I had a purpose. I was not just enduring. I was actively fighting back. I pulled out my camera, the physical manifestation of my grandmother's ingenuity, my only defense against this assault. My hands trembled, but my resolve was unwavering. This monolith was different. It didn't hold souls, but it projected despair. Could light counter that? Could it disrupt the whispers? I aimed the camera at the black monolith. Its surface was flat, featureless, absorbing all light, an antithesis to the luminous clearing I had just left. The whispers intensified as I drew closer, a concentrated wave of mental anguish, trying to make me drop the camera, trying to make me flee. No, I growled, my voice hoarse, barely audible above the din in my head. Not this time. I pressed the shutter button. The flash was instantaneous, a blinding burst of pearlescent light that seemed to pierce the very fabric of the gray clearing's oppressive darkness. It slammed into the black monolith with an almost physical force. The effect was immediate and shattering. The whispers, which had been a deafening roar, suddenly fractured. They didn't cease, not entirely, but they became disjointed, stuttering like a broken radio signal. Instead of a cohesive, crushing wave, they became a chaotic, broken babble, 1,000 fragmented voices screaming over each other, unable to form a coherent assault. The pressure on my mind lessened slightly but noticeably. And the monolith itself. For a fleeting moment, as the light struck it, I thought I saw a ripple on its surface, a momentary distortion, like heat haze but colder, blacker. The intense cold radiating from it seemed to waver, to become less absolute, replaced by a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor in the air. I took another picture, then another, each flash hitting the monolith like a physical blow. With each burst of pearlescent light, the whispers became more chaotic, more broken, less able to focus their assault. The feeling of despair, though still present, was less overwhelming, less paralyzing. I felt a surge of exhilaration. It worked. The camera wasn't just a ward, it was a disruptor. It couldn't destroy the monolith, just as my grandmother had theorized, but it could certainly interfere with its function. It could scramble its broadcast of despair. I took a few more shots, emptying the camera's small battery in the process. The whispers were still present, a low, maddening hum, but they were no longer a coherent assault. They were fractured, broken, confused. I quickly swapped out the battery, my fingers fumbling with the tiny compartment, the residual hum of the whispers still rattling in my head. With a fresh battery, the camera was ready again. Now, with the drain disrupted, I needed to check my GPS. I pulled it out, my fingers clumsy from the cold. The screen flickered to life. Again, a blinking dot, a location. It was still wildly inaccurate, different from the crystalline clearing's reading, but again, consistently so. I took a picture of the coordinates. This was crucial. I had 2 distorted location readings from 2 different nodes of the heart. Now, I needed the third. My next goal, the multi-seasonal meadow, the anchor. My grandmother had theorized it held the chaos in place. I wondered what effect the camera's light would have on that monolith, on that place. I turned, orienting myself towards the direction of the portal. The whispers, though broken, were still an unwelcome companion. The cold was still gnawing, but I pushed through, my resolve hardened. I walked quickly, my eyes scanning the endless, identical black trees, searching for the subtle shimmer that marked the path to the meadow. It was harder this time, the fractured whispers still interfering with my focus, but I found it. The faint, almost invisible distortion that twisted the light around it, near where I remembered the entrance to be. I reached out my hand, my fingers brushing against the invisible veil. A rush of cold, a fading of light, and the insidious, low hum of the whispers. This was the way. I took a deep breath and stepped through. The world dissolved into a chaotic, dazzling assault. The oppressive silence of the gray clearing shattered. The maddening whispers were instantly replaced by a maelstrom of conflicting sounds: the rustle of spring leaves, the crunch of winter snow, the buzzing of summer insects, the whisper of autumn winds. The cold vanished, replaced by a dizzying swirl of temperatures, from biting Arctic gusts to gentle spring breezes. The sterile void was ripped away, replaced by the overwhelming, clashing sense of snow, blooming flowers, wood smoke, and ripening berries. The ground beneath my boots was a chaotic patchwork of winter, spring, summer, and autumn. And in the center, the black monolith, silent, imposing, absorbing all light, a void against the dazzling backdrop. This was the anchor. My stomach lurched, my head swam. The overwhelming sensory input was just as disorienting as the first time, but I was prepared. I knew what to expect. I scanned the meadow, my eyes darting nervously towards the monolith, then across the seasonal divides. The shadow creature, was it here? The meadow was still, unnaturally still. The conflicting breezes rustled the various seasonal flora, but there was no sign of the shimmering void, no lurking form. It was still banished or hidden. The relief was immense, allowing me to focus on the terrifying task ahead. This black monolith was different from the one in the gray clearing. It didn't whisper, didn't radiate despair directly. It simply was, absorbing all light, a silent, imposing void at the heart of the chaos. My grandmother had called it the anchor, holding the chaos in place. What would the camera's light do to something that absorbed all light? Would it simply be swallowed, or would it cause a disruption? I walked towards the monolith, the ground jarring beneath my feet, the sensory assault trying to overwhelm me. The closer I got, the more intense the feeling of pure, primal wrongness became. It wasn't despair or sorrow, but sheer, unadulterated chaos. I raised the camera, my hand steady despite the violent fluctuations in temperature and scent. I aimed it at the heart of the black monolith, took a deep breath, and pressed the shutter. The flash was astonishing. It wasn't merely absorbed. As the pearlescent light hit the monolith, the black surface seemed to shimmer, almost ripple like water disturbed. For a fraction of a second, the monolith seemed to glow with an impossible internal light, a pure white-hot energy that was instantly swallowed by its blackness. Then the chaos around me intensified. The seasons seemed to clash even more violently. The winds howled with renewed fury, carrying ice and searing heat simultaneously. The scents became unbearable, a nauseating swirl of rot and sweetness. The ground bucked beneath my feet, the seasonal divisions blurring, melting into each other for fleeting moments before snapping back into jarring distinctness. I took another picture, and the chaos surged even further. The air around the monolith began to crackle with an unnatural energy, a high-pitched whine that cut through the sensory cacophony. The monolith itself seemed to pulse, no longer merely absorbing but actively reacting. It was as if the focused light from my camera was causing it to malfunction, to struggle against its anchoring role, allowing the inherent instability of the heart to surge. This was dangerous, very dangerous. The entire meadow was on the verge of collapsing into pure, unbridled chaos, but I had to push it. I had to see the limits of its reaction. I snapped a third photo, then a fourth. Each flash intensified the disruption. The high-pitched whine grew louder, almost deafening. The seasons around me were spinning, blurring, melting into a single, indescribable landscape of impossible extremes. The ground trembled violently beneath my feet. Suddenly, a massive, shimmering distortion appeared directly in front of the monolith, growing rapidly. It was the shimmering void, the shadow creature, coalescing from the very air, larger and more enraged than I had ever seen it. Its form was less defined, more like a swirling vortex of pure darkness, but its intent was clear. It was enraged. My heart leaped into my throat. It was back, and it was furious. The creature shrieked, a sound that tore through the chaos of the meadow, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage and pain. It lunged towards me, its form elongating, stretching, a black, tearing maw opening in its center. I reacted instinctively. I raised the camera, aimed it directly at the creature's center, and pressed the shutter button. This was its weakness. The pearlescent flash exploded outwards, hitting the shadow creature head-on. The creature shrieked again, a sound of agony this time, but it didn't dissipate. Instead, it recoiled, its form twisting violently, shrinking slightly, but still present, still enraged. The light had damaged it, but not banished it. It was stronger now, less susceptible. My disruption of the monolith had made it more resilient. I snapped another picture, then another, emptying the battery. Each flash made the creature recoil, but it always returned, its form reforming, its shrieks echoing through the maelstrom. It was a holding action, not a banishment. I quickly fumbled for a new battery, my hands shaking. The creature was still there, snarling, its dark form flickering at the edge of my vision as I swapped the battery. This was a nightmare scenario. I had pushed the anchor too far and awakened its guardian with renewed ferocity. With a fresh battery, I aimed and flashed again. The creature reeled, but this time it didn't just recoil. It seemed to hesitate, its form flickering as if caught between two states. The flashes were still hurting it, but it was adapting. I needed to make a tactical retreat. I had seen the monolith's reaction, and I had confirmed the camera's ability to disrupt the creature, even if it couldn't fully banish it in this heightened state. I needed to get my GPS reading and get out. With the creature momentarily stunned by my last flash, I pulled out my GPS. The screen displayed a third set of coordinates, still distorted but consistent. I snapped a quick photo. Now I had 3 data points, 3 distorted locations from the 3 monoliths. This was enough. The shadow creature was regaining its composure, its form solidifying, its shrieks of rage growing louder. I couldn't risk another direct confrontation right now. I had disrupted the anchor, and that had created a problem worse than the chaos itself. I needed to leave, immediately. I backed away slowly, keeping the camera aimed at the creature, ready to flash again if it lunged. The chaos of the meadow was still raging, a dizzying, terrifying assault on my senses. I turned and began to move purposefully towards the edge of the clearing, searching for the subtle distortion that led back to my world. The creature took a tentative step towards me, its form flickering with malevolent intent. I didn't hesitate. I raised the camera and flashed, buying myself precious seconds. It shrieked, recoiled, and I ran. I ran towards the summer section of the meadow where I remembered the distortion to be. The ground bucked and twisted beneath my feet. The air was a maelstrom of conflicting temperatures and scents. The shrieks of the shadow creature echoed behind me, growing fainter as I put distance between us. My eyes darted across the tree line, searching for the faint dimming of light, the subtle ripple that was my escape route. I found it, a barely perceptible blur in the shimmering, shifting wall of trees. I lunged towards it, my hand outstretched, my heart pounding in my chest. My fingers brushed against the cool, imperceptible veil. I could feel the familiar air of my own woods, hear the faint rustle of real leaves. I took a deep, shuddering breath and stepped through. The world stabilized instantly. The clashing seasons vanished, replaced by the uniform coolness of late autumn. The blinding light dissolved into the soft, golden light of late afternoon, filtered through the turning leaves, casting long, familiar shadows. The deafening chaos was replaced by the familiar sounds of the Adirondack wilderness, a distant bird call, the rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze. I stumbled forward a few steps, then collapsed to my knees, gasping for air. My body trembled uncontrollably, not just from exhaustion, but from the raw terror of the encounter with the amplified shadow creature. My chest ached, my head throbbed, and the phantom echoes of the meadow's chaos still reverberated in my mind. But I had done it. I had interacted with all three monoliths, disrupted their functions, and crucially, I had gathered my data. I pulled out my GPS, the screen now showing my solid, blinking dot firmly on the topological map about 10 miles from my cabin. The satellite signal was strong and clear. I quickly scrolled through the pictures I had taken of the distorted coordinates in the three clearings. Now I had to make sense of them. I needed to triangulate. I forced myself to stand, my legs still wobbly, my muscles screaming in protest. I needed to get back to the cabin, to safety, to my computer, to my maps. I started walking, my pace quick, driven by a desperate need to solve this puzzle, to find the central core before the heart of the woods completely destabilized, before the shadow creature became an insurmountable threat. The familiar deer trail stretched before me, now a path towards salvation, towards understanding. The woods, though still holding a lingering terror, were also my sanctuary, my refuge. As I walked, I thought about the GPS readings. The clearings distorted reality, warped space, but if the distortion was consistent, even if wildly inaccurate, there might be a central point where the distortion was minimal, or where the false locations converged when mapped against each other. That convergence point would be the central core. It was a long shot, a gamble on the consistency of impossible physics, but it was the only lead I had. The sun dipped below the tree line, casting long, eerie shadows. The woods grew darker, the sounds of unseen nocturnal creatures filling the air. Every rustle, every creak of a branch made me jump, but I kept pushing forward. I reached the cabin hours later, utterly exhausted, my body aching, my mind buzzing. I fumbled with the key, slammed the door shut, and locked it. The familiar comfort of my home was a welcome embrace. I sank to the floor, my backpack sliding off. I was home, safe for now. But the whispers, though faint, were back, a low hum in the deep recesses of my mind, a chilling reminder that the impossible was still out there. I dragged myself to the desk, pulled out my laptop, and transferred the GPS coordinate photos. I opened my mapping software, then meticulously plotted the three distorted coordinates from the clearings onto a separate, blank map. The coordinates were indeed wildly off, scattered across the digital map. But then I began to apply a mathematical model, a kind of inverse triangulation, trying to account for a consistent distortion factor. It was a complex problem, one that required guesswork and intuition, but I kept at it, adjusting, refining, trying to find the point where the distortions would cancel each other out or converge. Hours passed, the fire in the wood-burning stove crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The cabin was warm, but my mind was cold, calculating. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a single tiny point emerged from the chaos of numbers and lines. A precise coordinate, a convergence point. It was deep within the wilderness, a few miles from my cabin, but nowhere near the known portal location. It was a place I had hiked through countless times, a completely unremarkable stretch of forest, no distinguishing features. This had to be it, the central core, the fulcrum, the heart of the woods, my grandmother's final quest. I stared at the blinking dot on the map, a mixture of fear and triumph churning in my gut. I had found it. The impossible location, the true nexus of this monstrous reality. But finding it was only the first step. What now? My grandmother had said, you cannot destroy the breath of the world, you must redirect it, repurpose it, return it to its rightful place. What did redirect and repurpose mean in this context, and what was its rightful place? I thought about the shadow creature. My disruption of the anchor had made it more formidable. It was no longer a simple guardian, it was an enraged beast. If I went to the central core, it would undoubtedly follow. I had barely escaped it in the meadow. I needed to understand the mechanics of the heart more deeply. If the three monoliths were nodes and the core was the fulcrum, then they were all connected. Disrupting one affected the others and the creature. My grandmother's journals, I grabbed them, flipping frantically through the pages. I had focused on the how to find it. Now I needed the what to do with it. I found a section titled On Reintegration and Balance. She wrote, the heart is a living entity, but its current state is unbalanced, diseased. It draws power from disparate realities, creating chaos. To heal it, one must reintegrate the disparate energies, force them back into their original harmonious flow. It will be a wrenching process, a violent correction. Reintegrate the disparate energies, the clashing seasons, the despair, the lost souls. I had begun the process by releasing the souls from the crystalline monolith and disrupting the whispers from the gray one. And the anchor, when disrupted, had unleashed chaos. It seemed my camera was indeed a tool for reintegration, for forcing the heart back into a balanced state. But what about the shadow creature? My grandmother called it the hunter of the unwary, a manifestation of the heart's defensive mechanisms. If the heart was diseased, then the creature was a symptom, an immune response gone wild. To heal the heart, I would have to face its immune system. She had also written, the core is the heart's true eye, its sensory organ. To influence it, one must speak to it in a language it understands. Light, sound, and resonant frequency, and above all, intent. Light, sound, and resonant frequency. I had the camera for light, I had the voice recorder for sound. Resonant frequency, that was trickier. The hum from the twisted tree, the thrum from the crystalline monolith. Could I somehow replicate that or amplify it? And intent, my intent was clear, to stop this thing, to free the lost, to make these woods safe again. I also remembered Martha's words, what's on the ground that reflects the sky, and the idea that the core might be accessible or visible when a certain celestial body was directly overhead. I had dismissed the general meteor showers, but what about something more specific, something localized? I pulled out my phone again, looking up celestial maps. If the core was the true eye, perhaps it was attuned to a single, powerful celestial event, something that only happened once a year, or even less frequently. The nearest astronomical event of significance was the Leonid meteor shower, scheduled to peak in a few days. Not as prominent as the Perseids, but still noticeable. Was it enough? I continued to read my grandmother's journals. In one of the very last entries, a fragmented one, she wrote, "The true key lies in the alignment of Earth's own energies. Not celestial, but telluric, the deepest currents where the ley lines converge. The heart bleeds where the world itself is wounded. To mend the wound, you must channel the lifeblood back, a sacrifice of self, perhaps, or a conduit." Ley lines, telluric energies, Earth's own currents. This was far beyond my understanding, but she had also hinted at a peculiar alignment of stars and a subtle shift in the local magnetic field. The spinning compass, the distorted GPS, it all pointed to some fundamental terrestrial or magnetic anomaly. What if the subtle shift in the local magnetic field was the key, a temporary weakening or strengthening of Earth's magnetic field at the core site, making it accessible? And how would I detect that? I had a basic magnetic compass, but it only told direction. I didn't have a magnetometer. I pushed away from the desk, frustrated. I had found the core, but I didn't have all the tools or all the knowledge to complete the task. I had light and sound. I needed resonant frequency and a way to detect the telluric energies or magnetic shifts. I looked at the dog tags at Emily's charm. I thought of the countless lost souls. I couldn't give up. Sleep was impossible. The whispers in the cabin had intensified again, now a constant, low drone, a reminder of the task that still lay ahead. I was trapped not just by the woods, but by my own knowledge. I needed to return to solitude, to Martha. She might know more about my grandmother's research on telluric energies or ley lines. She might have something in the library or even something from her own family's history that could help. I gathered my things, leaving the rifle behind again. This wasn't a hunting trip. This was a mission to save the woods and perhaps the world. The drive to solitude was a familiar one, but my mind was racing with frantic calculations, possibilities, and fears. As I drove, the whispers slowly began to recede, but the sense of urgency remained, a burning fire in my gut. I parked my truck outside the general store. Mrs. Henderson waved as I entered, her flour-dusted apron a comforting sight. "Back again, John. You're quite the traveler these days." I managed a strained smile. "Just a bit more research, Mrs. Henderson." I bought some essentials, then headed straight to the library. Martha looked up as I entered, a knowing look in her eyes. "You found them, didn't you? Your grandmother's journals." I nodded, my voice low. "Yes, they're incredible, but I have more questions." "I thought you might," she said, gesturing to a chair. "Tell me." I couldn't tell her everything, not directly, but I could steer the conversation. My grandmother spoke of telluric energies, of ley lines, of the Earth's own currents. "Do you know anything about that? Any local legends, any old books that might describe such things?" Martha's eyes grew distant again, thoughtful. "Ah, the Earth's breath," she called them. She believed certain points in the land resonated with deep energies, currents that flowed beneath the surface, much like rivers. And where these currents intersected, she believed were power points, places where the veil between worlds could thin. The power points, I repeated, a thrill of recognition. Did she ever mention how to detect them or interact with them? She spoke of certain minerals, crystals, that could amplify or focus these energies, Martha replied, and of specific rituals, ancient practices passed down through generations that could attune one to their presence. But these were old ways, John, most have been forgot. She paused, then added, she did experiment with some devices, I recall. Simple things mostly, pendulums, dowsing rods. But she was always searching for something more precise, something scientific to measure the unseen. Did she ever find anything, I pressed, anything that could measure a magnetic shift or a resonant frequency in the land? Martha considered for a moment, then walked over to a locked cabinet behind her desk. She fumbled with a small key, then opened it, revealing a collection of dusty, old artifacts. She pulled out a small, ornate wooden box. "This belonged to my grandmother," she said, placing it gently on the table. "She said your grandmother, my great-aunt, actually helped her make it. It's a resonator," she called it. "Supposedly, it amplifies subtle frequencies in the environment, making them audible or tangible." She opened the box. Inside, nestled on a velvet cushion, was a device unlike anything I had ever seen. It was a finely crafted wooden box about the size of a small radio, made of dark, polished oak. On its surface were several intricate carvings, symbols I vaguely recognized from my grandmother's journals. In the center was a small, polished brass dial, and next to it, a single glowing crystal, small and multifaceted, embedded in the wood. A thin, braided copper wire extended from one side, ending in a polished, smooth stone. "How does it work?" I asked, fascinated. "You hold the stone and you turn the dial," Martha explained. "My grandmother said it would hum, or..." "A gentle hum," she said. "If there are energies present, it will vibrate and the crystal will glow more intensely." I reached out, my fingers tracing the smooth, polished surface of the oak box. It felt warm, almost alive. This was it. This was the missing piece. "Can I borrow it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Martha smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "That's why it was left for me, not for me to use, but for me to give when the right person came looking. Your grandmother knew you'd come. She knew what you'd need." She pushed the box across the table towards me. "Just be careful, John. Some forces, once awakened, are difficult to put back to sleep." I carefully took the resonator, feeling its surprising weight. It felt ancient, powerful. My grandmother, she mentioned a subtle shift in the local magnetic field. Could this detect that? Perhaps, Martha mused, her gaze distant. She believed that these telluric currents were often strongest or most perceptible during specific planetary alignments or when cosmic energies touched the Earth. She spoke of a rare moment when the Earth breathes in, drawing in energy, making these points visible to the attuned. A moment of profound stillness before a great exhale. "A moment of profound stillness," I repeated, a new piece of the puzzle falling into place. "Before a great exhale." My grandmother's fragmented note about a peculiar alignment of stars and a subtle shift in the local magnetic field resurfaced. The Leonid's meteor shower was still days away. Could there be a more immediate, precise alignment, a terrestrial one that the resonator could detect? She also believed that the core of these energies, what she called the true heart's eye, would be most receptive at such a time, Martha continued. when the barrier between the worlds was at its thinnest, yet paradoxically also at its most stable. Stable, I asked, confused. My experience in the heart was anything but stable. Stable enough for interaction, for redirection, Martha clarified. Not destruction. Your grandmother was adamant about that. You cannot destroy something that is part of the world's breath. You must guide it, heal it. Heal it, that word resonated deeply. My grandmother's journals had mentioned healing the heart, reintegrating its energies. Do you know anything about what that healing would entail? Martha shook her head slowly. That was beyond her, I think. Her research became very esoteric towards the end. She spoke of a song to quiet the storm, a light to mend the fractured world. Poetic, but not practical. She looked at the resonator. Perhaps this will help you find the rhythm of that song. I thanked her again profusely, feeling a surge of renewed hope mixed with a profound sense of responsibility. I had the light, camera, the sound, voice recorder, and now the resonant frequency resonator. I had the coordinates of the central core. I just needed the timing. I left the library, the resonator box clutched carefully in my hands. The whispers, which had been silent on the drive here, were now a faint, almost imperceptible hum, growing subtly louder as I turned towards my cabin. The proximity to the heart always seemed to amplify them. Back in my cabin, the hum was more pronounced, a maddening pressure that made thinking difficult. I placed the resonator on my desk next to my laptop and the open journal. I needed to test it. I picked up the smooth stone at the end of the copper wire. It felt cool, comforting. I turned the brass dial slowly. At first, nothing. Then, as I turned it further, a faint, almost subliminal hum began to emanate from the wooden box. The small crystal in the center pulsed with a soft internal glow, a very subtle flicker of light. I continued to turn the dial, fine-tuning the frequency. The hum intensified, a low, resonant thrum that I felt in my bones, not just heard with my ears. It wasn't unpleasant, but deeply unnerving. It felt like the cabin itself was vibrating in sympathy. The crystal glowed brighter, casting faint, shifting shadows. This was incredible. This was what I needed. I continued to experiment with the dial, trying to find a peak frequency. As the hum reached a certain intensity, the whispers in my mind, which had been a constant low drone, suddenly shifted. They didn't disappear, but they became different, less aggressive, more like a distant, confused murmur. It was as if the resonator's frequency was somehow disrupting their frequency, creating interference. This was a profound discovery. Not only could it detect energies, but it could also interfere with the heart's psychic assault. It was another defensive tool, another layer of protection. I spent the next few hours poring over my grandmother's journals again, cross-referencing her notes on telluric energies and power points with the resonator's potential. She had hinted that the heart was not just a place, but a living, breathing mechanism that responded to intention and harmony. To reintegrate, its disparate energies meant to bring harmony to its chaotic core. A song to quiet the storm, Martha had quoted. My grandmother had also mentioned sound as a key. My voice recorder. I had to record the hum of the resonator at its peak and perhaps combine it with other sounds, with my own voice, my own intent. But first, the timing, Martha's mention of a rare moment when the earth breathes in, still echoed in my mind. A moment of stillness, a unique alignment. I looked at the map on my laptop screen, the blinking dot marking the central core. It was an unremarkable patch of forest, surrounded by tall pines. How would I know when that moment of stillness arrived? I went outside, taking the resonator with me. The woods were quiet, save for the chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves. The whispers here were a low, constant presence, a soft pressure behind my ears. I walked a short distance from the cabin into the deeper woods. I held the stone in my hand and slowly turned the dial on the resonator. The hum began, faint at first, then growing. The crystal pulsed. As the hum intensified, the whispers around me seemed to falter, to become less coherent. I kept turning the dial, trying to find the strongest resonance, the clearest hum. And then it happened. As the dial clicked into a specific position, the hum reached an astonishing pitch, a deep, resonant vibration that I felt through the soles of my boots. The crystal blazed with an inner light, a steady, warm glow. And everything else went silent. The crickets stopped chirping, the wind died, the rustle of leaves ceased. Even the whispers, the omnipresent whispers, vanished completely, utterly, leaving behind an astonishing, profound stillness. It was as if the entire forest held its breath. This was it. This was the moment of profound stillness Martha had described, the earth breathing in. The resonator had found it, detected it, or perhaps even created it. This was the window. But this was just a random spot in the woods, not the central core. I needed to be at the core itself when this moment occurred. How would I know when it was happening there? The resonator could detect it, but I needed a way to predict it, or at least a signal. My grandmother's notes on a subtle shift in the local magnetic field. That was it. The resonator was responding to some magnetic or telluric energy fluctuation. I could use it as a detector. I hurried back to the cabin, my heart pounding. This was happening sooner than I thought. I didn't have days to wait for the Leonids. I had to prepare and be ready to move the moment the resonator signaled that stillness again. I spent the next few hours frantically organizing my pack. Camera, fresh batteries, spare batteries, my primary weapon and disruptor. Voice recorder, fresh batteries, spare batteries for sound. I needed to record the resonator's hum, perhaps even my own voice speaking my intent. Resonator, the key to detecting the moment of stillness and influencing resonant frequency. GPS for navigating to the core and monitoring any shifts. Rifle for last resort. The shadow creature was formidable. Food, water, first aid, headlamp, compass. I also considered the portable mirror. My grandmother had hinted at reflections being important. Perhaps it could reveal something at the core. I tucked it into my pack. The sun began to rise. I hadn't slept, but adrenaline kept me sharp. The whispers were back, a low, persistent drone, but now I had a way to counter them, to find the quiet. I opened my laptop, pulling up the map with the triangulated coordinates of the central core. I memorized the path, then transferred the coordinates to my GPS. It was a hike, a few miles into the woods, through thick forest, away from any marked trails. I would hike to the coordinates, set up a temporary camp, and wait for the resonator to signal the moment of stillness. I took a deep breath, the cold morning air filling my lungs. This was it, the final journey, the confrontation with the heart of the woods. I shouldered my pack, the rifle feeling heavy and strangely comforting. The camera hung around my neck, the resonator clutched in my hand, its cool stone a grounding presence. I stepped out of the cabin. The whispers were loud now, a sibilant drone that seemed to emanate from the very trees themselves, a chorus of protest against my intrusion. But I ignored them, focusing on the mission. I set off into the woods, not following the deer trail to the portal, but striking out cross-country towards the core coordinates. The forest was dense, the undergrowth thick. I pushed through brambles, climbed over fallen logs, my boots sinking into the damp earth. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made me jump, my hand instinctively going to the rifle. The shadow creature was a constant threat, and I knew it would come for me, especially now that I had disrupted its nodes. As I hiked, I kept the resonator active, its hum a low, constant thrum in my hand. The crystal pulsed faintly, indicating the presence of subtle energies, but not yet the stillness. The hum of the device seemed to keep the whispers at bay, muting their insidious assault, allowing me to think clearly, to focus. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, filtering through the dense canopy in shifting patterns of light and shadow. The woods felt ancient, primordial, every tree a silent witness to countless millennia. My GPS guided me steadily. Finally, the blinking dot on the screen showed I was almost there. I pushed through a particularly thick patch of ferns and stepped into a small, unremarkable clearing. It was exactly as the map had suggested, utterly mundane. No monolith, no shimmering distortions, no peculiar trees. Just a small circular patch of forest floor covered in leaf litter and moss, surrounded by perfectly ordinary pines and birches. There was nothing to suggest it was the heart of an interdimensional engine. Nothing except the almost imperceptible thrumming in the air, a vibration I felt more than heard, and the subtle, almost hypnotic glow of the resonator's crystal. This was the central core, the true fulcrum. I dropped my pack, immediately scanning the perimeter. No shadow creature, not yet, but I knew it would come. I took out my voice recorder, switched it on, and began to record the subtle hum of the resonator. Then I spoke into it, my voice low but firm, stating my intent. I am here to reintegrate, to heal, to return what has been taken, to bring balance. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind, intent. I set up a small, temporary camp at the edge of the clearing, just enough to be comfortable while I waited. I double-checked all my gear, loaded the rifle, and made sure the camera was ready. Then I sat down, holding the resonator, and waited. The day slowly turned into afternoon. The hum of the resonator was a constant companion, its crystal glowing steadily. The whispers were completely absent in this specific clearing, either suppressed by the resonator or because the core itself was a place of true, silent power, not chaotic noise. I spent the time meditating on my grandmother's words, on Martha's insights on the nature of the heart. It wasn't evil, they both implied, but rather a system, a mechanism, now diseased, unbalanced. My task was not to destroy, but to heal, to repurpose. As the sun began its descent, casting long, golden shadows across the forest floor, the hum of the resonator intensified. The crystal began to glow more brightly, pulsing with a deep, internal warmth. I felt a subtle vibration in the ground beneath me, a faint tremor that was growing stronger. The air around me grew still, profoundly still. The rustle of leaves, the distant bird calls, the faint buzz of insects all slowly faded away, replaced by an absolute suffocating silence. It was the moment of profound stillness, just as before, but far more intense, far more encompassing. The air itself felt heavy, thick with unseen energy. This was it, the earth breathing in, the window of opportunity. I stood up, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. I was at the core. The moment had arrived. I held the resonator in my left hand, the camera in my right. My voice recorder was clipped to my jacket pocket, still recording. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. And then it appeared. Not subtly, not coalescing from the shadows. It simply materialized at the far end of the clearing, fully formed, immense, and terrifyingly real. The shadow creature. It was larger than ever, its form a swirling vortex of absolute darkness, edged with an angry, pulsating crimson light. Its two glowing eyes, like twin coals, burned with an infernal rage. It shrieked, a sound that seemed to rip the fabric of reality, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury. The moment of stillness shattered, replaced by the creature's primal roar. The air around it shimmered with malice, radiating an intense cold that hit me like a physical blow. It lunged. I reacted instantly. My grandmother had engineered this camera for a reason. I raised it, aimed at the creature's swirling core, and pressed the shutter. The pearlescent flash exploded outwards, a blinding lance of pure light that slammed into the shadow creature. It shrieked again, a sound of agony, and recoiled violently, its vast form twisting and shrinking, momentarily disrupted. But it didn't dissipate. It was still there, enraged, recovering. I snapped another picture, then another, a rapid-fire assault of light. Each flash made the creature writhe, but each time it recovered faster, its form reforming, its crimson eyes burning with increased malevolence. The disruption of the anchor had indeed made it more resilient, more formidable. It was adapting. I emptied the battery in a desperate attempt to drive it back, but it held its ground, battered but not broken. I quickly swapped in a fresh battery, my hands shaking, my eyes never leaving the creature. It shrieked again, a challenge this time, and surged forward, closer. I could feel the cold radiating from it, the raw terror it exuded. "No," I roared, my voice raw, filled with defiance. "Not this time, not here." I aimed the camera and flashed again, buying myself a precious moment. The creature recoiled, but then its form seemed to solidify, to grow denser, more resilient. It was absorbing the flashes, somehow integrating the light, becoming stronger. My weapon was losing its efficacy. This was a nightmare. My primary defense was failing. I dropped the camera and instinctively snatched the rifle from my shoulder, bringing it to bear. It was a futile gesture, I knew. Bullets wouldn't harm a creature of shadow, but it was a last resort, a primal scream of defiance. The creature paused, its crimson eyes fixing on the rifle as if amused. Then it lunged again, faster, its shadowy tendrils reaching out, grasping. I fired. The shot cracked through the sudden silence of the clearing, a pathetic human sound against the roar of the impossible. The bullet passed straight through the creature, leaving no mark, no impact. It was upon me. A wave of absolute cold, a crushing despair, slammed into me as the creature's shadowy form enveloped me. I felt its impossible touch, a freezing agony that tried to tear my very soul from my body. My mind was assaulted by 1,000 whispers, a cacophony of lost voices, of primal fears, all screaming at once. I dropped the rifle useless. I was suffocating, dying. But even as the cold, the despair, the whispers tried to overwhelm me, the resonator in my left hand blazed. Its crystal pulsed with an intense, steady light, hotter than ever, vibrating with a deep, resonant hum that cut through the cacophony in my mind. It was trying to protect me, trying to counter the creature's assault. And in that moment, a flicker of an idea, a desperate, insane gamble, flashed through my mind. Light, sound, and resonant frequency, and above all, intent, my grandmother's words. I still had the voice recorder, still active, clipped to my jacket pocket. It was recording the intense hum of the resonator. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, I shoved my hand into my pocket, fumbling for the recorder. The creature's grasp tightened, the cold searing, but I fought through it, my fingers finding the small device. I pulled it out, raised it towards the creature, towards the swirling vortex of its being that encompassed me. The resonator's hum was